Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen and FBI Director Christopher Wray were on Capitol Hill today for a hearing on national security threats. Topics included domestic and international terrorism, cybersecurity, and aviation safety. At one point, Director Wray was also asked by Senator Kamala Harris about the FBI's investigation into sexual assault allegations against Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. This hearing is 2.5 hours.
Good morning. This hearing come to order. I want to thank all of our witnesses first for your service to this nation. I know none of your jobs is easy, but they're incredibly important. So I want to thank you for taking your time for your testimony and for coming before us here today, and look forward to your oral testimony and your answers to our questions. I do want to start out by also thanking the audience for being here. This is an annual hearing we have really talking about the very serious threats facing our nation. So it's a serious hearing, and I just want to warn everybody, your position, your responsibility in the audience is to listen, not to participate. So any kind of disruption, either verbal or signs, whatever, will be dealt with immediately by the Capitol Police, and you'll be asked to leave. So again, please sit and listen to everything respectfully. It's hurricane season, and unfortunately we have another hurricane, or Category 4 hurricane, barreling down on, now it's the Florida Panhandle. So I do want to make sure that we all keep anybody in the pathway of Hurricane Michael in our thoughts and prayers. And you know, Secretary Nielsen, obviously, I think FEMA has really been stepping up the plate. We've learned a lot of lessons from these prior natural disasters, and I'm sure you're in pretty good position to do everything we can to aid the state and local emergency first responders to this hurricane as well. Our committee has pretty simple mission statements: to enhance the economic and national security of America and promote more efficient and effective government. Within that mission statement, we have established 4 priorities of things that we're really trying to concentrate to enhance the economic and national security. First one is border security. I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about that today. We've held more than 24 hearings on various aspects of our border, and you know, unfortunately, I have to say our border is not secure, not even close. And if we kind of put up our first chart, a hearing wouldn't be a hearing with me as chairman without some charts. We've had a real problem in terms of incentives our own broken legal immigration system create for people coming in this country illegally. This is the first one we'll highlight: the incentives for family units coming across the border. In 2015, the Flores settlement was reinterpreted, and you can see the result. Don't have final 2018 figures, but we're already exceeding the record years of 2016, 2017 of people coming into this country illegally as family units. It's a problem that has to be fixed. This committee is working on a bill called the Families Act to try and address that problem with this Flores reinterpretation. Looking forward to working with the administration and all of my colleagues to actually fix one problem. Not comprehensive immigration reform, but just identify a particular problem, hopefully in a nonpartisan way, looking at facts, figures, actually fix the problem. Next chart deals with another issue which has not been solved: unaccompanied children. I think the cause of this is pretty obvious. In 2012, deferred action on childhood admissions or arrivals was implemented, and you can see the results. I know we called this a humanitarian crisis in 2014. We got pretty good at apprehending, processing, and dispersing children across country. Senator Portman has done a great job of talking about just the problems in dealing with this, large number of children coming in, taking a very dangerous journey through Mexico into our country. And again, that's something Secretary Nielsen is having to deal with because we have a broken legal immigration system. We don't have secure borders. Our next area of priority really is cybersecurity. I do want to enter in the record a letter I received from Suzette Kent, the CIO of the administration working within OMB, talking about the really inadequacy of our federal government's cybersecurity. In this letter, she cites that OMB recently published a Cyber Risk Determination Report and Action Plan. The report found that federal agencies do not possess or properly deploy capabilities to detect or prevent intrusions or minimize the impact of intrusions when they occur. She goes on to cite some statistics. The FY 2017 annual FISMA report to Congress noted that from January 2016 through April 2017, the National Cybersecurity Protection System detected only 1,600 of 44,823 incidents across the federal civilian networks via the Einstein sensor suite. That's a 3.56% detection rate. In addition, NCPS detected only 379 of 39,171 incidents across federal civilian networks via the Einstein sensor suite from April 2017 to present. That's a 1% detection rate. So total from January 2016 to the present, our Einstein cybersecurity protection system within the federal government is only detecting 2.4% of the incidents. I'm assuming that's not a real good detection rate. Cybersecurity is an incredibly complex issue. There's nothing easy about it whatsoever. And so I'm sure we'll be talking about that today as well. Our fourth area of priority is really critical infrastructure. And I am glad to see that the Department of Homeland Security has now issued their strategy on EMP, electromagnetic pulse, and geomagnetic disturbance in terms of that threat to our electrical system. We'll be looking at that. I've scanned it. I haven't been able to read it in great detail, but we need to do a whole lot more on that. And then finally, we're going to be talking, our fourth area of priority is really countering terrorism and extremism in any form. We got one final chart. This is where I think there's some marginally good news. The State Department issues a study called the START Report, the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism. And I think this is pretty dramatic in terms of the number of attacks, the number of deaths due to terrorism. Now, I realize this is a very imperfect report. I realize that, and there's been kind of breaks in how we collect the data. But I think the trends are still pretty interesting. You can see the real spike in 2014. These are really deaths, terrorist attacks, a lot of them associated with ISIS and Iraq. And you can see when we actually deal with the problem, let's face it, we've taken away the caliphate. We've taken away that territory. And you can see the result in terms of progress, in terms of total all deaths due to terrorism. So again, we've got a lot to talk about. I don't want to continue on with my opening comments, and I'll turn that over to Senator McCaskill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I appreciate how difficult your jobs are and how you've got to stay focused on your priorities, sometimes with so much political chaos swirling around you that it's got to be really hard on some days to keep the blinders on and do your work that the American people are depending on. And I want you to know I appreciate those challenges. And many of us here, while we may be disappointed at various outcomes that your agencies are responsible for, there are many of us that realize that you have some of the toughest jobs. And your responsibility is so huge. And I want to particularly, Director Wray, express to you how much I respect the men and women that you lead. I had been honored to have an opportunity to work with them shoulder to shoulder as a prosecutor for many years. And they are dedicated, they are nonpartisan, they get up every day and give it everything they've got. And there is really a lot of reasons that Americans should be very proud of the FBI, and I wanted to say that before we began tonight. Make sure that you communicate that to them, how many of us around the country understand the work they're doing and how important it is and how we need to keep politics out of their way. In my state across the country, I think one of the biggest threats that we have faced in the last several years in terms of deaths to the American citizens and to people in Missouri is the opioid epidemic. It is a public health crisis, but it is also a border security crisis. The border may seem far away from Missouri, but the epidemic is now being fueled by dangerous drugs that transnational criminals are smuggling into our country through our mail and also through our ports of entry at the border. Earlier this year, I released a series of reports from the minority staff of this committee analyzing efforts taken by the Department of Homeland Security to stem this crisis. The report's findings were ominous. The seizures of illicit fentanyl, the most fatal opioid that my citizens in Missouri and others in their states face, but by Customs and Border Protection are increasing dramatically. Despite this, we have still failed to adequately resource the ports of entry, where the overwhelming majority of these opioids enter the country. There has been an awful lot of emphasis on getting Border Patrol agents along the border and securing the length and breadth of our border, but we have not focused enough on adequately resourcing the ports of entry as it relates to these illegal drugs coming into our country. Traffickers are also smuggling the narcotics into this country through the mail, and Senator Portman has worked on this. Many of us have. Our report found that mail facilities have the largest number of individual seizures of opioids. Even though the Postal Service alone, apart from carriers and like FedEx and UPS, process more than 1.3 million packages every day, we have fewer than 400 postal port officers to inspect them. And sure enough, just last week, the DHS Inspector General found that CPB's international air mail inspection is not effective to stop illegal drugs from entering the United States. I'm very glad, Secretary Nielsen, that CPB has agreed with the IG's recommendation to conduct a cost-benefit analysis to determine what additional staff and resources are necessary to adequately address the threat from opioids in the mail. I look forward to that analysis when it is completed and working with you to fix the problem, to get you the resources that are necessary to address this. In addition to the threat posed by the smugglers and the traffickers, we also face threats online. Nearly everyone recognizes that Russia interfered in the 2016 election, and there's no reason to expect this sort of interference will just go away in the future. DHS is not responsible for administering elections, of course, but it does offer support to our state and local election officials to help strengthen and secure their systems. We are now less than 4 weeks away from the midterm elections, with early voting already underway in several states. I hope to hear an update from Director Wray and Secretary Nielsen about the nature of their threat and the confidence that our systems and personnel are prepared to handle it. Hackers can do more than just interfere with election systems. DHS and the FBI issued a startling alert in March, putting critical infrastructure owners and operators on notice that the Russian government was targeting a number of sectors, including nuclear, energy, water, and aviation. Just last week, the Justice Department charged 7 Russian intelligence officers with conducting cyber attacks against anti-doping agencies, athletes, and others in retaliation for their opposition to Russia's state-sponsored doping program. A witness at one of our hearings just last month testified that in this new era is akin to cyber trench warfare. All this hostile activity takes place in that gray space where the aggression from an adversary doesn't necessarily elicit a formal takes place in that gray space where the aggression from an adversary doesn't necessarily elicit a formal aggressive response. The American people maybe cannot know all that we are doing, but it is important for this committee to understand that we are dealing with this aggression in a way that not only meets that aggression, but counters it in a way that provides a deterrent for future actors like Russia that is trying to interfere in our way of life. There unfortunately isn't enough time to discuss in any hearing all the threats that our country faces. That's why I'm glad the chairman held a hearing last month on the evolving threats that we face, which I know Secretary Nielsen has worked hard on, from drones and the vulnerability of our cyber supply chain. I think the chairman would agree that when our committee has been alerted to a new threat, we've tried to work in a very bipartisan manner to address it. Just last week, the 2 bills the chairman and I worked on closely together passed the Senate. the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Act, and our Countering Drone Bill, which the President just signed into law. Both of those measures will go a long way towards arming agencies with the tools they need to keep Americans safe. So I'm glad to have all of you here today to talk about the threats we face and what to do about them, and most importantly, what we can do to help. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Senator McCaskill, I did forget to ask consent to have my written opening remarks be entered in the record. It is the tradition of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if you all stand, raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. Our first witness is the Honorable Kirstjen Nielsen. Secretary Nielsen is the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. On December 6, 2017, Secretary Nielsen was sworn as the 6th Secretary of DHS, and she previously served as the White House Deputy Chief of Staff. Secretary Nielsen.
Good morning, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member McCaskill, and distinguished members of the committee. It's a privilege to appear before you today to discuss how the Department of Homeland Security is confronting worldwide threats. I'd ask that my written testimony be submitted to the record. I'll give you some highlights in the oral testimony. First, I wanted to spend a moment on natural disasters. As the chairman said, right now we have a major Category 4 hurricane reaching the Gulf Coast of the United States. This is an incredibly serious storm. We're expecting damaging winds, life-threatening storm surge, deadly flash flooding, and more. I urge everyone watching this and everyone at home in its path to heed the warnings and listen to local authorities. DHS and our Federal Emergency Management Agency stand ready to support the local response. We are pre-positioned and ready to go, and the thoughts and prayers of the nation are with those in the storm's path. On the subject of today's hearing on man-made threats, though, I want to first note that we are witnessing tectonic shifts in the threat landscape. Whether it is terrorists, transnational criminals, or hostile nation-states, the bad guys are finding cracks in our defenses and are exploiting them through novel ways to attack us. My department will soon release an updated strategic plan that will highlight how we are taking a holistic approach to respond in this new age of threats. We call it our Resilience Agenda. Last month, I spoke at George Washington University about 5 major changes in the threat landscape. Today, I'd like to highlight those changes, how we are meeting them, and I'll submit, as I said, a longer statement for the record. First, we must recognize that the home game and away game are no longer distinct. They are simply one and the same. After 9/11, our strategy was to take the fight to enemies abroad so we did not have to fight them here at home. Unfortunately, that is no longer the world in which we live. Our enemies do not respect borders and are not constrained by geography. Today's threats exist in a borderless and increasingly digital world. So we are changing our operating posture to follow suit. We are integrating foreign and domestic threat mitigation activities, forward deploying our people to source zones, and partnering wherever possible so we can take an end-to-end approach to dismantling threat networks. Secondly, terrorism and transnational crime have spread across the globe at fiber optic speed. Whether it's global jihadists or super cartels, we are seeing our enemies crowdsource their operations and spread chaos like never before. After 9/11, we faced a centrally directed terror threat. Today, the threat can exist virtually anywhere at any time. Self-radicalized terrorists are appearing across the globe and hiding in virtual safe havens online. Groups such as ISIS and al-Qaeda now direct, finance, and inspire attacks from their smartphones, turning Twitter followers into terrorist foot soldiers. Last week, the President released a bold new counterterrorism strategy, laying out the path to victory against these fanatics, and he has directed us to step up the fight against transnational criminal organizations. Criminals are exploiting the same environment and are spreading rapidly, outsourcing their work, diversifying their activities, and cooperating with ever wider cabals of identity forgers, money launderers, smugglers, traffickers, drug runners, and killers. They are not only embedding their enterprise further in the physical world, they are also selling their illicit wares in the virtual world. In the past 2 years, DHS has put in place sweeping security enhancements to confront these dual threats. For instance, we are securing the border with new wall personnel and technology. We now require every nation on Earth to start exchanging critical threat data with us to make it harder for the bad guys to reach our territory undetected. We ramped up screening and vetting of foreign travelers, including required deeper background checks, deploying advanced technology, and operationalizing a groundbreaking new National Vetting Center. We've put in place the most significant changes to aviation security in a decade, and we are working with the tech sector to make it harder for terrorists and criminals to weaponize the web. Third, we are witnessing a resurgence of nation-states threats. Countries such as China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia are willing to use all elements of national power to undermine us, and the overall threat from foreign adversaries is at its highest levels since the Cold War. This is not a fair fight. Neither private companies nor citizens are equipped to oppose nation-state threats alone. So DHS is forging nationwide partnerships to protect our country. With weeks to go until the midterms, top of mind for most Americans is the Russian interference in our 2016 elections. This was a direct attack on our democracy. We should not, cannot, and will not tolerate such attacks nor let them happen again. In the past 2 years, DHS has worked hand in hand with officials in all 50 states and the private sector to make our election infrastructure more secure than ever by sharing intelligence, forward deploying cyber experts to do voluntary scans and secure systems, and promoting best practices. By the midterms next month, our network security sensors will cover 90% of registered voters. And on Election Day, we will be out in full force and hosting a virtual nationwide situation room to assist our partners. DHS is also undertaking new partnerships with industry, interagency partners such as the FBI, and international stakeholders to counter foreign interference in our democracy and to prevent adversaries from infiltrating U.S. companies and critical industries. Fourth, cyber attacks now exceed the risk of physical attacks. Don't get me wrong, terrorist criminals and foreign adversaries continue to threaten the physical security of our people. But cyberspace is the most active battlefield, and it extends into almost every American home. For instance, the viral spread of volatile malware has reached the pandemic stage, a worldwide outbreak of cyber attacks and cyber vulnerabilities. We saw it last year when both Russia and North Korea unleashed destructive code that spread across the world, causing untold billions in damage. In response, the White House and DHS have released new cyber strategies that outline how we are changing the way we do business. In July, we hosted the first ever National Cybersecurity Summit, where I announced the launch of the DHS National Risk Management Center. This will serve as a central hub for government and private sector partners to share information and to better secure the digital ecosystem together. We're also driving forward ambitious supply chain security efforts to identify upstream weaknesses before they have downstream consequences. And perhaps most importantly, DHS is working with our partners throughout the administration to hold cyber attackers accountable. The United States has a full spectrum of options, some seen, others unseen, and we are already using them to call out cyber adversaries, to punish them, and to deter future bad behavior. Additionally, I want to thank this committee for its hard work to authorize the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS. We hope the House will pass this vital legislation next month, as the agency is the cornerstone of our to protect our U.S. networks. Fifth and finally, emerging threats are outpacing our defenses. Unmanned aerial systems, often referred to as drones, are prime examples. Criminals are already using drones to surveil, smuggle, kill, and destroy, and our country is in the crosshairs. Until now, we've been nearly defenseless. I want to thank this committee for helping us to secure the authorities to identify, track, and mitigate dangerous drones in our homeland through the FAA Reauthorization Act, as Senator McCaskill just mentioned. This was a monumental achievement, and we have already begun planning for how to use these authorities to protect Americans. At DHS, we are also concerned about weapons of mass destruction. Terrorists and nation-states continue to pursue the development of chemical and biological weapons to conduct attacks. Last December, I formed the DHS Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office, one of the most important DHS reorganizations in years. But the office does not have all of the authorities needed to defend our country against chem and bio threats. The House passed legislation to fix this vulnerability, and we urgently need the full Senate to do the same. I again thank this committee for working with us to get this done as soon as possible. In closing, I cannot tell you, and I always must add this at the end, I cannot tell you how proud I am to lead the 240,000 men and women of the Department of Homeland Security. It is a truly humbling experience. I want to thank them and their families for their service, sacrifices, and dedication to our great nation. And I want to thank each of you for supporting them and recognizing their patriotism. Every day they roll up their sleeves and go to work to protect the homeland and to build a better and safer America. They enforce the laws passed by Congress, they believe in accountability, and they are relentlessly resilient. Thank you again, and I look forward to your questions about the myriad threats that face the homeland today.
Thank you, Secretary Nielsen. Our next witness is the Honorable Christopher Wray. Director Wray is the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. On August 2, 2017, Director Wray was sworn in as the 8th FBI Director. He previously served as Assistant Attorney General of the Department of Justice in charge of the Criminal Division. Director Wray.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member McCaskill, members of the committee. I'm honored to be here to discuss the serious and evolving national security threats we face and our efforts to counter those threats. National security remains the FBI's top priority, and counterterrorism is still a paramount concern, but that threat has changed significantly since 9/11. We're not just worried about large, structured terrorist organizations like al-Qaeda plotting large-scale, spectacular attacks in big cities like New York and D.C., although that threat definitely still exists. Now, of course, we also face groups like ISIS, which use social media to lure people in and inspire them remotely to attack whenever and wherever they can. And we now face homegrown violent extremists, or HVEs, who self-radicalize at home and are prone to attack with very little warning. This HVE threat has created a whole new set of challenges with a much greater volume of potential threats, and each one of them with far fewer dots to connect and much less time to prevent or disrupt an attack. These folks are largely radicalized online, and they're inspired by the global jihadist movement. Right now, as I sit here, we're currently investigating about 5,000 terrorism cases across America and around the world. And about 1,000 of those cases are homegrown violent extremists, and they're in all 50 states. In the last year or so, we've made hundreds of arrests of terrorism subjects. Those include things like the arrest of a guy plotting to attack San Francisco's Fisherman's Wharf on Christmas Day with a combination of vehicles, firearms, and explosives. Or the arrest, Mr. Chairman, of a woman in your home state, a Wisconsin woman, maintaining a virtual library of instructions on how to make bombs, biological weapons, and suicide vests to assist self-proclaimed ISIS members. We've also disrupted a plot to blow up a shopping mall in Miami or to blow up a number of the celebrations of July 4th in Cleveland. In the cyber arena, the threat continues to grow, and the more we shift to the internet as the conduit and the repository for everything we use and share and manage, the more danger we're in. Just last week, as Senator McCaskill noted, the Department of Justice announced indictments of 7 Russian military intelligence officers for, among other things, hacking American citizens and organizations as part of an effort to distract from Russia's state-sponsored doping program. Nation-state adversaries, and China in particular, also pose a serious threat as they seek our trade secrets, our ideas, and our innovation. And they're using an expanding set of non-traditional methods to pursue their goals, like cyber intrusions, foreign investment, corporate acquisitions, and supply chain threats. The threat of economic espionage affects businesses in every region and every sector of the United States, from big cities to rural areas, from big corporations to innovative startups, from chemicals to agriculture. But China is not the only adversary looking to steal our ideas and innovation. In March, in one of our cases, indictments were unsealed against 9 state-sponsored Iranian hackers who were affiliated with the Mabna Institute, a private government contractor based in Iran. They were charged with stealing 31 terabytes of proprietary data from 30 American companies and scores of universities and compromising hundreds of universities all around the country and throughout the world. As the midterm elections approach, of course, the FBI is also working with our interagency partners to identify and counteract the full range of foreign influence operations targeting our democratic institutions and values. Last fall, I established at the FBI a new foreign influence task force, which brings together the FBI's expertise across disciplines. We're talking about counterintelligence, cyber, criminal, and even counterterrorism to root out and respond to foreign influence operations. In addition to investigations and operations going on in all of our field offices around the country, the Foreign Influence Task Force is focused on information and intelligence sharing with our partners in the intelligence community, as well as with our state and local partners to establish a common operating picture. The task force is also focused on building even stronger relationships with technology companies through classified briefings and the sharing of actionable intelligence so that they can better secure their networks, products, and platforms. In conclusion, we face serious and evolving national security threats, and staying ahead of those threats is a significant challenge. But the strength of any organization is its people. Every day at the FBI, I see people tackling their jobs with strength, with honesty, and with professionalism. The threats we face as a nation have never been greater, and the expectations of the FBI have never been higher. But the men and women of the FBI continue to meet and exceed those expectations every day. I'm proud of the FBI's work, but I'm even more proud to be part of it. Thank you for having me here today, and I look forward to answering the committee's questions.
Thank you, Director Wray. Our third witness is Mr. Russell Travers. Mr. Travers is the Acting Director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Acting Director Travers has been in his position since December 24, 2017. He previously served as the NCTC's Deputy Director and as a Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Transnational Threat Integration and Information Sharing on the National Security Council. I believe this is your first time testifying before this committee under my chairmanship, but I will say that that introduction doesn't do your long government service justice. You started out in 1978 as an Army intelligence officer. So, again, welcome and look forward to your testimony.
Yes, sir, I'm really old. Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member McCaskill, members of the committee. It is a privilege to be here representing the men and women of the National Counterterrorism Center to discuss threats to the homeland. In the years since 9/11, the U.S. counterterrorism community and its many partners have achieved significant successes against terrorist groups around the world. Most notably, coalition operations against ISIS in Iraq and Syria are depriving the group of its last territorial holdings in the so-called caliphate. In addition, ongoing CT efforts across Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia continue to diminish the ranks of al-Qaeda and ISIS, removing dozens of experienced leaders and operatives. Interagency efforts to enhance our defenses at home, including strengthened aviation security measures and border control initiatives, have resulted in substantial progress in safeguarding the homeland from terrorist attacks. There is indeed a lot of good news, but we need to be cautious because challenges remain. I'll highlight just three. First, military operations have bought us time and space as we address a global terrorist threat, but the diverse, diffuse, and expanding nature of that threat remains a significant concern. After 9/11, we were primarily focused on a single piece of real estate in Afghanistan and Pakistan. 17 years later, as Director Wray mentioned, we have a homegrown violent extremist threat. We have almost 20 ISIS branches and networks ranging from hundreds to thousands of individuals around the globe, al-Qaeda and its branches and affiliates, tens of thousands of foreign fighters that flock to Iraq and Syria from 100 countries, and Iran and its proxies. In toto, our terrorist identities database has expanded by well over an order of magnitude since 2003. There will always be an important role for military force in dealing with this threat, but the resonance of the ideology will not be dealt with by military or law enforcement operations alone. The world has a lot of work to do in the non-kinetic realm to deal with radicalization and underlying causes. The second challenge stems from terrorist ability to exploit technology and the attributes of globalization. They're good at it, and they're innovative. We've seen the use of encrypted communications for operational planning and the use of social media to spread propaganda and transfer knowledge between and amongst individuals and networks. We're in the early stages of seeing terrorist use of drones and UASs for swarm attacks, explosive delivery means, and even assassination attempts. High-quality fraudulent travel documents will increasingly undermine a namespace screening and vetting system and threaten border security. We will see greater use of cryptocurrencies to fund operations. And the potential terrorist use of chemical and biological weapons has moved from a low probability eventuality to something that is considered far more likely. In many cases, terrorist exploitation of technologies outpaced the associated legal and policy framework needed to deal with that threat. And the third challenge relates to our ability to process and analyze ever-expanding amounts of data in order to uncover potential terrorist plots. The last time I testified before this committee was 8 years ago, in the aftermath of the attempted Christmas Day bombing. Back then, I focused on the difficulties of finding non-obvious relationships between two pieces of information that existed in a veritable sea of data. As a government, we have made substantial progress against that problem, but the problem itself has grown dramatically. Since 2009, when Umar Farouk Abdulmuttalib tried to blow up Northwest Flight 253 over Detroit, we have seen an explosion of information, encrypted social media, publicly available information, and captured electronic media from investigations and the battlefield. As the haystack has gotten bigger and the needles more subtle, prioritization becomes extremely difficult. Determining which information is relevant and addressing the competing legal, privacy, policy, operational, and technical equities remains a work in progress. In closing, Mr. Chairman, the terrorist threat poses something of a paradox. The near-term potential for large-scale, externally directed attacks against the homeland has declined as a result of U.S. and allied actions around the globe. But the threat itself continues to metastasize and will require very close attention in the years ahead. In a crowded national security environment, it is completely understandable that terrorism may no longer be viewed as the #1 threat to the country. Nevertheless, we will need to guard against complacency. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Travers. Out of respect for my colleagues' time, I'm going to defer my questions to the end. We also set the, I think we're going to set the clock for 7 minutes, aren't we? Okay, thank you. But I want to keep, again, for everybody to be respectful, I'm going to be guarding that clock. And I'd ask the witnesses as well, if a senator does what senators often do, ask a question right at the 7-minute mark, we'll take that for question for the record, because we need to stay within the 7 minutes so everybody gets their questions in. But I'll defer to Senator McCaskill.
I will. I'll just ask one question right now and then defer to my colleagues. I'm really concerned about the fact that we have had a fairly significant increase in not detaining people that are not in this country legally, but are on the suspected terrorist list. In 2016, there were less than 150 detained that were on the suspected terrorist list and less than 150 that were non-detained. In 2017, we detained 300 people in this country that were on the suspected terrorist list, that were in this country illegally, but the non-detained jumped to over 2,000. And then as of September, that number of non-detained is over 2,500. Somebody has got to explain to me how we have room, how we're advocating for indefinite detention of families, and how we have room for pregnant women and thousands of children. But we are failing to detain those people in this country illegally that we have identified as suspected terrorists.
Let me try to lay it out at the front end. So there's different types of detention, as you know. So HHS has the detention for unaccompanied children. That is explicitly used for that population. We can't mix others in that population. We have family residential centers that ICE administers. We cannot put single adults in those facilities. And in fact, in those facilities, we have to be very careful not to mix and match families, not mix and match sexes. So there's very strict rules as to how we can house them. In the single adult detention, we can also not use or not allow either of the other populations to be present there. So at the end of the day, what it comes to is just resources. There's different buckets of detention space. I believe the detention space you're talking about is the detention space reserved for single adults. We use every last bed that we have. But yes, we need more detention space.
Well, I just got to tell you, our country has watched, had a front row seat, where we have detained a lot of people, children even, that are not a threat to our country. I don't think most people in my state would understand why prioritizing suspected terrorists has not happened. To me, the most important job we have is to be deporting criminals that are violating our laws and hurting people, making sure we arrest the criminals that are in this country illegally, that are violating the law, and detaining people who are suspected terrorists. And I would like, Secretary Nielsen, for you to report back to this committee how you intend on getting all these suspected terrorists detained as quickly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Portman.
Thank you, Chairman. This is a hearing where there are so many topics to raise, and we don't have enough time to do it all, but let me just focus on a few quickly. One is the drug crisis, and it was referenced earlier. We have an opioid epidemic, as everybody knows. What people perhaps don't know is the role that fentanyl has played. 4,000% increase in fentanyl overdose deaths in my home state in the last 5 years alone. Now the #1 killer in America, in Ohio. Fentanyl 50 times more powerful than heroin. Relatively inexpensive, can be made synthetically, therefore sort of a boundless supply. Most of it's coming from China. Most of it's coming through the mail system, I'm told by your experts, Secretary Nielsen, and also from the DEA and other law enforcement folks. Question is, what are we going to do about it? The STOP Act has now passed the House and Senate. We expect the President to sign it next week. It helps in telling the post office you have to finally actually screen these packages. I guess I'm looking for a couple of things. One is a commitment by you, Madam Secretary, and I know you have been with us on this issue for the last few years as we've tried to get this through. Despite resistance from the post office, you have been saying that your Customs and Border Protection people need these tools to be able to identify packages, the needle in the haystack that Director Travers talked about. Will you commit today to rapidly implement that legislation, working with the post office to be sure we don't continue to have people who are dying from this disease who don't have to die because we are just allowing this flow of fentanyl to come into our country through our own postal service?
Absolutely, and I want to thank you for your leadership. It's greatly appreciated. You've worked with us very closely to get that STOP Act done. So between that and the Interdict Act, which this committee was also very helpful in getting across the goal line, yes, absolutely, we will work with the post office immediately.
What more do you need to be able to stop the fentanyl from flowing into this poison coming into our neighborhoods?
So what we're working on now, actually, and somewhat with my partners to the left, what we're trying to do is target the networks and the smuggling areas abroad. So before it ever comes here through the mail, we are working with foreign countries. We're working with Interpol, Europol. We have a lot of bilateral agreements. Whenever I meet with our allies, I talk to them about this. But the idea is to have a regional approach and to dismantle the smuggling networks from the top down.
My sense is that cocaine production is increasing fairly dramatically in Colombia right now, of course coming into Venezuela, where much of that country, I think, is now in the hands of narco-traffickers, essentially. Coming up through Mexico, crystal meth, of course, coming from Mexico, continues to increase numbers in the last few years. So it's not just opioids. But I will say with regard to fentanyl, you tell me, it's primarily China, isn't that correct?
Yes, that's
You talk about going to the source of the problem. Why is it that there are literally thousands, I'm told, of chemical companies in China producing this stuff that is killing American citizens, and by the way, leaking into the Chinese communities as well, I'm sure, and why haven't we been able to do more about that?
So we have a dialogue with the Chinese, the judicial dialogue. DOJ leads that along with State Department, but that is top of the agenda, is to work with them and get much more aggressive commitments than we've ever had before. But yes, it's coming from China. We need to do more. As you know, all of our canines have now been imprinted with fentanyl, so we work at the express consignment locations and the international mail facilities. So we'll continue to do our part, but then we'll expand it to work with our other partners.
Well, thank you. I'm joined by Senator Carper, Senator Johnson, Senator Carper, Senator McCaskill, and I have spent a lot of time on this issue, and we want to be sure that our legislative initiatives are being implemented rapidly before more people die. On the issue of cyber attacks, you talked a little about these malign actors who are causing over $100 billion of damage to our economy already. You talked about your resiliency strategy. Recently, Senator Hassan and I introduced legislation that this committee has reported out on these cyber response teams, trying to both authorize what you're already doing and expand those. We think this would also go a long way toward cementing your department as the lead on dealing with cyber attacks on the public sector. I guess my question to you is, you talked about resiliency. What more can we do to avoid the cyber attacks on the public sector?
Well, first, I do want to thank you for that bit of legislation. I know our teams are working on the technical assistance, but we thank you for that. The hunt and incident response teams that DHS has to deploy are a very, very important part of the puzzle. As you know, we work on the full spectrum from awareness through to prevention and protection through to mitigation and response. But yes, so we thank you for that. In terms of what more is needed, we don't need any additional authorities at this time. What we have announced is the creation of the National Risk Management Center, and through that, by bringing in the private sector, with our public partners, what we hope to do is identify those essential functions and systemic risk that would result in cascading consequences should they be attacked. So we're moving away from an asset-based approach to essential functions. We want to keep the lights on. We want to keep communications going. We want to keep the provision of health care available. So through that look at systemic risk, we will increase our partnerships and be able to really focus on what's most important.
Yeah, well, obviously, as all three of you said, this is a crisis, and it's getting worse, not better, and there are state actors involved as well as individual hackers. The state actors, by the way, tend to line up exactly with our adversaries, don't they? Secretary Wray, Director Wray.
Absolutely, and we have had a number of significant cyber investigations that have resulted in charges involving China, involving Russia, involving Iran, involving North Korea even. We just, I think it was just a few weeks ago, indicted a guy who was part of a North Korean front company that, on behalf of the North Korean government, was responsible for the WannaCry ransomware attack, the Sony Pictures intrusion, and the Bank of Bangladesh, tens of $1 million heist. So it's all four of our adversaries are active in this space.
So this is sort of the new hybrid warfare, and obviously there's a lot more we can do. Let me just ask you a question to all three of you, but primarily perhaps to you, Secretary Nielsen. We have an issue right now with privacy concerns online. So a lot of social media companies have a lot of information from the people we all represent. I think unwittingly a lot of people give up their private information to these social media companies. So we talk about the concern in the financial sector, we talk about the concern in the energy sector, the healthcare sector from cyber attacks. We don't often talk about the fact that there's so much private information out there that is on the web, is available to telemarketing companies, certainly, and I'm hearing more and more from my constituents about it. Are you concerned about that as well? And what kind of protections do these companies have? These treasure troves of private information are out there. Are they properly protected?
Let me start enforcing 7 minutes now. If you have a quick response, that's great. Otherwise, take it for the record.
Okay, it's probably somewhere between us, but really quickly, just to add to what you're describing, we also are very worried about the availability and integrity of information. So all that private information online, if there's a cyber intrusion, it can be altered or it can be frozen through ransomware. So we're looking at all three of the attacks on private information. Yes, that is a threat.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our three witnesses for being here today. Secretary Nielsen, I've heard from communities in Michigan that current grant opportunities are simply not enough to support operations for local law enforcement units who are responsible for policing roughly 700 miles of international waterway borders. This is especially true for Michigan's smaller counties that are home to large segments of that border. Objective 2.1 of the DHS Northern Border Strategy discusses the department's responsibility for international waterways and developing a coordinated vision with local partners. So just quickly, I'd like to certainly have your commitment and hopefully work with your office to make sure we're directing resources to these communities and their law enforcement agencies in the Northern Border Strategy implementation plan. Do I have your commitment to that?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Secretary Nielsen, how the federal government spends money is obviously a reflection of our values, and it's certainly true for the DHS. Your spending is a reflection of your priorities and your values, and under your authority, DHS notified Congress that DHS transferred tens of millions of dollars from a variety of DHS components, including the U.S. Coast Guard, TSA, FEMA, and ICE to fund detention and removal of migrants, including children. Is that correct?
These were year-end monies that we're not going to be able to spend. As you know, at the end of the year, end of the fiscal year, towards the end of the fiscal year, each department goes back through all of our allocated funds to determine if there are any that will not be used. We put that into a pot. Part of that pot went to any of the emerging threats, such as the one Senator McCaskill mentioned, which is we do not have enough detention space for those that we need to hold who are single adults. And
so you did transfer funds. The answer is yes. It was at the end of the year.
Yes, and we notified Congress. Yes, sir.
So if Congress doesn't meet your demands in terms of funding for detention centers or border wall construction, do you intend to continue this practice of transferring funds from other critical DHS components to detention centers?
What we will do each year is be a good steward of the American taxpayer money. If there are monies that are going to go unused, we'll put it in a pot, and then we'll divide it out amongst our highest risk programs that need additional funds.
A few weeks ago, I asked the Executive Associate Director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the Acting Deputy Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection, how long is too long to detain a child, and whether DHS has reviewed the extensive literature discussing the long-term consequences and trauma with detention on children. Unfortunately, neither one could give me an answer during that hearing, so I'm going to ask you, how long is too long to detain a child?
We do not at the Department of Homeland Security detain children. As you know, children are in the care of HHS, but in general, the answer is as short amount of time as possible. HHS works very hard to place those children with sponsors or family members.
So what is short? How short a time as possible? What do you consider? And I guess I asked that in relation to there's extensive literature on this subject and discussing what impact it has on children. Have you reviewed that literature?
I am familiar with it. As you know, under Flores and TVPRA, there are particular requirements that HHS must comply with before they can place a child. They do that as quickly as possible. Sometimes it does take a bit of time to find a family member within the United States, which is the first category. But I'm sure they could provide additional information. So
are you concerned about detention of children?
I am concerned that we need to take the best care of them that we can and to place them with a family member or sponsor as soon as possible.
Secretary Nielsen, at the United Nations a few days ago, the President claimed, and I'll say, quote, China has been attempting to interfere with our upcoming 2018 election. A few days after, however, at the Washington Post Cybersecurity Summit, you said, and I'll quote you here, that there's no indication that a foreign adversary intends to disrupt our election infrastructure. The President has likened China's behavior to that of Russia, a country that certainly mounted a very successful disinformation campaign against us and cyber attacks in 2016. So my question to you is it possible that there's a threat to the institution or infrastructure of U.S. elections that you don't know about, but the President feels is appropriate to speak about in front of an international body like the UN?
So there's two threats that we see from nation states, at least two, with respect to our elections. One is the hacking or attempted disruption of the election infrastructure. As you know, that is an area that DHS has lead in supporting our state and local election officials. And the other is the much more widespread foreign influence or foreign interference campaigns. China absolutely is on an unprecedented or exerting unprecedented effort to influence American opinion. And Director Wray might be able to speak more to that because FBI has lead on the influence. But what I was making very clear during that panel that you mentioned is that we have not seen to date any Chinese attempts to compromise election infrastructure.
And Secretary Nielsen, you should be in receipt of a letter dated October 2nd sent to the DHS and the U.S. Election Assistance Commission from 30 academics, security experts, and election integrity activists expressed grave concerns about the use of cellular modems to transmit unofficial election results. Michigan is one of the states, along with Wisconsin, Florida, and Illinois, that use this technology. And according to a recent Detroit Free Press article, Michigan does not utilize encryption and other security features in place to prevent hacking, but highlights potential weak links in our critical election infrastructure. So my question to you, has the DHS made specific security recommendations to the states that utilize modems to transmit election data?
We have provided general making sure it's on. We've provided general training and information with respect to not plugging into the internet, which is another way of saying not to transmit through constantly through electronic means, and we will continue to work with them. As you know, each election is done differently in terms of security depending on the operational environment in which it's in.
Well, that leads to my last question here. Has the DHS taken proactive steps to reach out to states when vulnerabilities come to light, or is the department taking more of a reactive stance when states report problems or opt for specific assistance?
So if we have any threat information from the intel community or from other states who have seen nefarious activity on their networks, we do proactively reach out. We also, through our network of Albert sensors, through the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, real-time monitor network traffic. And by the election, about 90% of those voting will vote in areas that are covered by those sensors. So we do proactively provide threat indicators and, sure, vulnerabilities if we see them, although the most common vulnerabilities are change your passwords, have a supported system, and patch your system.
Okay. Thank you.
And again, I'll remind everybody to be watching that 7-minute clock. Senator Kyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of the witnesses. As Senator Portman said, the responsibilities between the three of you are enormous, and they relate everything to our country's national security right down to each local community's problems in dealing with these threats. Let me turn to a very real and very specific problem in a small community in Arizona. Primarily, Secretary Nielsen, my question will be for you. Yuma is a small town on the border between California, Arizona, and Mexico. It's primarily a farming community. There are a lot of people who are citizens of Mexico who come into the United States daily to work in the United States in and around Yuma. But it is also a place where there is significant illegal border crossing, everything from illegal contraband and drugs to smuggling of people. Because of two phenomena, one of which is the family apprehensions rate, and the chart that the chairman has showed in our previous hearing and this hearing demonstrates the enormous increase in family apprehensions in the recent months, and the Flores decision, which places a limit on the amount of time that you have to evaluate the illegal entries and determine what to do with the people who've been detained. The combination of those two things has put enormous strain on your agencies and on communities as well. Just last Sunday, on October 7th, ICE began to curtail reviews of these family units in Arizona in the Yuma sector because the numbers are simply overwhelming its capacity to do those reviews and deal with the local community agencies that have been assisting to provide transportation and housing and education and medical care and food and the like. Yuma Mayor Douglas Nichols has called us and said, could you please inquire as to what we can expect in the future, what we can do to help, but what they can do to help us. The community reaches out and does a lot of this itself, but if these reviews are not being done because the numbers are too overwhelming, then the fact is that people in Yuma are going to be threatened to some extent by an enormous number of illegal entrants into the country, and some of whom may not be making asylum claims. Some of these people may be dangerous, notwithstanding the fact that they have children with them. So one of my questions is, do you know how many of the people who are detained in this particular sector or any sector have made their asylum claims, or how many are simply here illegal without any colorable claim to be here?
Sir, I do not have that figure in front of me for Yuma, but we're happy to get right back to you.
Well, how would you prioritize the cases here if I simply can't, within the timeframes required by Flores, engage in the review that's necessary here and is simply releasing all of these people into this small community? What can we tell the community?
So two things, as you described, we have two limitations currently with respect to family units. One is the amount of detention space for family residential centers, and the second is the Flores settlement agreement, which limits our ability to hold past 20 days. When you put the two together with the increase in family units, we saw another 30% increase between July and August. The numbers are vast. When we have families in the family residential center, we're able to spend quite a bit of time with them to determine where they would like to go, where their family, if they have some, is in the United States. As you know, we arrange for travel, et cetera. When we're not able, because we don't have space or because we can't keep them in a facility long enough to have that conversation, what we do and what you've seen in Yuma is we reach out to the NGO community and try to work with them to receive them as they come out of our care.
Right, and the NGO community is now overburdened as well. So given the large numbers, hundreds and hundreds, and the short time frames, what can we expect your agency to do or to recommend that other parts of the government can assist with in order to solve this problem? Because right now, as of last Sunday, they're flooding into the community with literally no ability to do anything about it.
My department will continue to ask Congress to pass legislation to clarify that families can be detained until they are removed. If they have an asylum claim, they can be detained until we can adjudicate that asylum claim. But, sir, that is the solve. We need the ability to keep families together.
Would you please put somebody on this and get back to me as soon as possible so that I can get back to the mayor?
Yes, sir.
To let him know and to let the citizens of Yuma know that the government here is trying its very best to work to solve this problem. Director Wray, I have a specific question for you, and it really goes to an assessment, and Mr. Travers, I think probably you related to this as well. There's a lot in the news about the threat from Russia, especially with regard to cyber attacks and specifically with regard to our election process. But because of what you've said about China, is it possible to say that China does not represent at least an equal threat in several different venues here, not only in the cyber area, but also the disruption of and the disinformation campaigns that have been discussed earlier, as well as the theft of data and the like?
Well, Senator, I'm reluctant to try to rank threats, but I would tell you that I think China in many ways represents the broadest, most complicated, most long-term counterintelligence threat we face. Russia is in many ways fighting to stay relevant after the fall of the Soviet Union. They're fighting today's fight. China is fighting tomorrow's fight, and the day after tomorrow, and the day after that, and it affects every sector of our economy, every state in the country, and just about every aspect of what we hold dear. So certainly it's a very significant counterintelligence threat.
Well said, and I appreciate your answer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member McCaskill, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today, not only for being here, but for your service. And I hope, I will just add my comments to the Chair and Ranking Member. Please thank all the men and women who you lead as well for their service. Director Travers, I wanted to start with a question to you. The administration has talked quite a lot about decimating ISIS and destroying its safe haven in Syria and Iraq. With that said, I'm concerned that ISIS and its so-called caliphate aren't as devastated as we might think they are. In August, DoD reported that ISIS currently has more than 30,000 fighters across Syria and Iraq, a number that was reinforced by the UN's ISIS monitoring body. And just last week, the Institute for the Study of War, a nonpartisan think tank, released a new study entitled ISIS Second Resurgence that argued that ISIS is reconstituting its forces in Syria and Iraq and is using those 30,000 plus fighters to raise funds and reassert control over key swaths of land. These reports are obviously very concerning, especially since at this time 2 years ago, ISIS's ranks were being eroded on a daily basis. The terror group was being evicted from Mosul, and allied forces were beginning to encircle ISIS's last stronghold in Raqqa. If we have failed to finish the job of crushing ISIS, as these reports suggest, then a reconstituted ISIS safe haven in Iraq and Syria will threaten not only the region but the U.S. homeland by giving the groups area from which they can plot and direct attacks against Americans. So, Director Travers, how do you square the reports I've just mentioned with your testimony that really says that the administration we're in the final stages of defeating ISIS? Does ISIS currently have 30,000 or more fighters in Iraq and Syria?
These numeric estimates are low confidence, to be sure. There is no question that ISIS has taken huge hits. 95+% of the territory they once held, they no longer hold. There are some small pockets in the Euphrates Valley. There are some fighters in Idlib, to be sure. The key is to keep pressure on them, without a doubt. The key is to be thinking longer term in terms of Sunni disenfranchisement, because we could be replaying the same problem that we had from several years ago. We saw them several years ago begin to be thinking about how to implement an insurgency strategy, and they're burrowing down, and we certainly see this throughout Iraq and Syria. And so if we don't keep pressure on them, and if we don't address the problems of disenfranchisement, we should expect to see problems in the future.
Well, thank you for that, and I'd look forward to working with you and your team because I just think we have to keep the pressure on, and we can't act as if the problem has gone away, because it hasn't. Director Wray, one truly emerging threat that I don't believe we're effectively grappling with is the threat of deep fakes, or the use of video editing practices enhanced by artificial intelligence to create convincing video impersonations of public figures and government officials. While impersonations and video editing have existed for years, these practices have never achieved truly convincing impersonations. Now that appears to have changed as these technologies have both become more precise and much more accessible. The result is that the old adage of the camera never lies may no longer be true. The use of deepfakes for national security purposes would be a nightmare. Imagine deepfakes being used to make it look like a Secretary of Defense would no longer back an ally or would threaten imminent action against a rival. This false rhetoric could trigger mass protests or instability in regions, force impulsive reactions from countries who fall for the ruse, and cause massive shifts in stock markets across the world. So, Director, can you please share with us how the FBI is seeking to adapt to the emergency of low-cost deep fakes, and what steps you're taking to prevent deep fakes from being used to undermine U.S. national security?
Well, Senator, I think you're exactly right that it's a topic of great concern. We have a number of our science and technology folks burrowing in on this issue. There's probably more that could be discussed in a different setting than say this one. But I do think it illustrates a broader problem, which is every time we have some great new technology, I have two reactions. One is, wow, that's awesome. I can't believe we can do that. Right. And then, oh my God, I can't believe they can do that. Right. And this is a great example of that.
Well, thank you. And I would also, and we'll follow up with writing with you, just want to make sure that you all have the authorities and the tools that the FBI needs to better address and prevent deepfakes. So we'll follow up with you on that. Another question for you, Director Wray, which I hope will be a quick one. Last May, during an interview, President Trump stated that the FBI's senior leadership was composed of, quote, several rotten apples, close quote. Can you please just answer me yes or no? Do you agree with the President that there are rotten apples within the Bureau's senior leadership?
Well, Senator, I can only tell you about the FBIC, which is people of great courage, integrity, and professionalism. And I have now met with the offices representing every state of the senators up on this dais, and they are extraordinary people that this committee and all Americans should be proud of.
Thank you very much. And I would agree with that. My honor of getting to know some of the FBI folks in New Hampshire has been a true honor. So, Secretary Nielsen, I wanted to touch on one last issue with you to follow up on your testimony before his GAC last May. At that hearing, I asked you about the capacity for the United States to conduct inspections of traffic leaving the U.S. and heading southbound into Mexico. As you know, as part of the Merida Initiative, the U.S. has pledged to increase southbound inspections in order to stem the flow of guns and money from the U.S. into Mexico that help fuel violence and empower the Mexican drug cartels. And I'll note that it's my understanding that we are seeing fentanyl not only come into the country through our mail, but come in through Mexican cartels, and that there's some evidence that cartels are beginning to manufacture fentanyl as well. However, when I visited both the southern border and Mexico last spring, I was surprised to see little southbound inspection at the land ports of entry, and my Mexican interlocutors consistently raised this with me during my meetings in Mexico City. At the May hearing, you pledged to investigate the current capability of the United States to conduct robust southbound inspections and to work with this committee to address gaps in these inspections. Realizing I'm out of time, I'll ask that we follow up on the record of this, but I'll ask that you update us on your assessment of our southbound inspections.
And if I could just really quickly say, yes, ma'am, we have done that. I've had no less than a dozen conversations with Mexican counterparts, current and in the future Lopez Obrador administration. Happy to come brief you. We have a lot of good news there on how we're increasing capacity.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your being here today and for your service. And Director Wray, let me also echo the comments about you and the FBI. As we discussed, before I got into this chair, I was a former U.S. attorney and was happy to sign a letter recommending you for this position, and I commend you for the job you're doing, and I hope you will pass along to everyone in the FBI. I butted heads a lot of times with the FBI, both as a prosecutor and defense lawyer, but I have incredible respect for that institution and the people there, so please pass that along. I would like to talk just a moment about the homegrown threat that you've talked about. We tend to, in this day and age, think of the homegrown threats in terms of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But I have maintained for many, many years that this is not a new threat. It was, in my opinion, an act of homegrown terrorism when a bomb exploded in 1963 at an African-American church, killing 4 girls. It was an act of homegrown terrorism when the Murrah building exploded, when the Olympic Park bombing occurred, and I believe certainly that there are terrorist-type threats, homegrown, when people march through the streets of Charlottesville saying Jews will not replace us. Charleston, 9 people killed. Again, if you look on the internet, Dylan LaRoof had all manner of things. So my question is, and I know some of this answer, but I'd like for you to just publicly talk about those threats, what the FBI is doing, because I know you're taking them seriously. But I don't want those kind of threats to get overlooked because they're threats on mosques, there's threats on Jewish community centers, bomb threats. Would you address just a little bit what the FBI is doing and how you're addressing the threats that come from what I call the far right, the Klan, neo-Nazis, those folks who do just as, they do a lot of damage in this country as well?
Well, thank you, Senator. Certainly, the category that you're describing, we usually bucket as what we would call domestic terrorism. And we have also, it's an easy number for me to remember, about 1,000 active investigations into domestic terrorism. Now, those cover the waterfront of the full range of extremist ideologies from right to left and everything in between. But we have assessed that that's a steady, very serious threat, and I think we've had 100 some odd arrests just of domestic terrorism subjects, over the last year or so. So it's something we take very seriously, and every JTTF, every Joint Terrorism Task Force, a structure that you would be well familiar with from your past, is very active in the domestic terrorism space as well, and it's something we take very seriously.
Are you looking as well as the Internet? What I saw back 15 years ago when I was U.S. Attorney was, at that point, the rise of the Internet caused the Klan and others to seek these lone wolves, not the organized. Are we still monitoring that on the Internet just like we do the Al-Qaeda and ISIS? Is that also being monitored?
Well, just to be clear, we don't just monitor the Internet for a variety of reasons. Under Attorney General guidelines and domestic investigation operating guidelines, we had to be careful of First Amendment reasons and so forth. But certainly when we have properly predicated investigations that go into Internet activity and social media, we are active in that space. I would say that in general, the domestic terrorism threat, which we were just discussing, as opposed to the homegrown violent extremists, which we would categorize as the ISIS-inspired or
right.
global jihadist-inspired, seems to be less online recruitment and online inspiration than the HVEs. Their inspiration on the domestic terrorism front seems to come through other means slightly more often.
All right, thank you. Secretary Nielsen, recently, and I want to follow up just a little bit on Senator Portman's questioning about fentanyl, because I appreciate the efforts that are happening. It's a huge, huge problem across this country. And I appreciate your efforts of trying, as you said, I think, talking to China and others. I'm particularly worried about China. Recently, Senator Toomey and I introduced a bill. He was the real lead on this, the S-3463, the Blocking Deadly Fentanyl Imports Act. You're working with China, you're working with others, but I think I think most people would tend to believe that these manufacturing plants in China would not exist without some type of either state-sponsored recognition. They know about them. They've got to know about them in China. This bill really will talk more about trying to deal with sanctions if a country does not deal adequately with this issue. Are you familiar with that bill? And if you can't get the kind of help that you want out of countries like China, is the United States willing to go and to do some type of sanctions to put the pressure on China to close these mills down?
Sir, I'm not, but I am very happy to come talk to you about this. We need a bigger stick. We need to make it very, very clear that we will not tolerate this. I don't disagree. I don't have any evidence to provide to you that it's state-sponsored, but I think given the director's broad description of Chinese activities in almost everything that happens in their commercial sector, I would agree that that is a very strong possibility. So be happy to work with you and provide technical assistance back and forth on
All right, great. Well, we will get you a copy of that bill that's been introduced, and I would like to follow up that. And Mr. Chairman, I've got a few seconds left, but I'll just submit my questions for the record. Thank you all for being here today.
I'm sorry. Senator Heitkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for the wonderful work you do and the great people you lead, many of whom I visit on a regular basis in my state. And so I think we stand united in supporting the men and women of law enforcement who are doing an excellent, excellent job. Sometimes we have some gaps. Director Wray, as you know, deeply concerned about the lack of inadequate policing in Indian reservations in my state. We talk about threats against the homeland. We know that there have been cartels operating, especially during the Bakken boom in North Dakota. This is a place where you have primary jurisdiction. We've talked about this a lot. People in Indian communities across my state continue to express great concerns about their public safety. And I've met with your agents in Minot. They're doing, I mean, some of these guys are working literally 20 hours a day, 24/7. I'm not exaggerating. You're going to burn them out, and you got to get them more help. please, 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 please. This is so, so important because what happens on our reservations in North Dakota does not stay on our reservations in North Dakota. And so we'll continue that conversation, but I wanted to lay down that marker because when we talk about security threats, I think sometimes we ignore the unique challenges that reservations have. Secretary Nielsen, I want to talk a little bit about the Northern Triangle countries. You and I have had a lot of discussions about different kinds of strategies that we can deploy, and I know I keep hearing about the best way to protect the homeland is to prevent these migrants and asylum seekers from making the journey north. There's some people who think you do that by, you know, in strategies that don't address the root causes of why people migrate. So I have had conversations with several people that have been involved in or invited to the Conference on Prosperity and Security who are really concerned about whether DHS is in fact engaging with the nonprofits and advocacy groups in the region. I think you can't do this alone. There's no way we can do this alone. And so I would just implore you to maybe tell us a little bit about what you're doing there, but to do better outreach with some people who are potential partners who could be tremendously helpful. You know, when we look at the population of the Northern Triangle countries, that population is you know, many of these countries not as large as California. So there is a real opportunity, I think, to have an impact. So if you could just talk about your engagement with the Northern Triangle countries and how we can better connect you with partners.
Well, Senator, I thank you and others on the committee for your continuing dialogue with me on this. We have to address both the push and the pull. We have to. So the push factors, we have spent a lot of time analyzing what those are, working with the United Nations in particular to understand. I called for a ministerial in Guatemala. I've been there now a couple times to talk with all of my counterparts in the countries and the social fabric, the NGOs there, about how we can take care of vulnerable populations as quickly as possible. It should not be that if you need to seek asylum, you have to pay a smuggler or trafficker to do that. There has to be a better way to protect them sooner in the process. Spent a lot of time in Mexico, a lot of time talking.
With that, have you reviewed Senator Carper's and my bill?
Which one?
It's the bill that would allow for asylum seekers to apply in country, not make the migration north. And has DHS taken a position on that?
We have not, but I would be more than happy to come speak with you about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about what is it going to be that is going to help us, and Senator Carper's here and he can talk about that further, but we agree. So it's always nice when you can find those things that we all agree on. We all agree that the worst thing for these families is to migrate north. It's a dangerous, dangerous journey. Many times they're indentured for their lifetime, paying off the people who traffic in or actually smuggle human beings. We got to keep those two terms separate. But I mean, I really believe that this is the sweet spot, working with the NGOs, working with the communities, if in fact we are going to recognize, which is where we maybe have a point of conflict, that American law allows for people to seek asylum here. And we'll have to have a structure for, in fact, responding to those asylum applications. And so we would really appreciate it if you would take a very hard, close look at the Northern Triangle countries and what we can do to seek asylum there and work with Senator Carper and with me to try and find some kind of legal path forward for doing that. I want to switch just to the northern border. I would disappoint, I think, everybody on this panel if I didn't talk about the northern border. We continue to have staffing problems. We continue to be concerned. You know, I want to thank you for the strategy and now the implementation, but I think that there has to be better ways to improve the opportunities for workforce on the northern border. And could you just, in the time that I have remaining, speak to the work that you're doing and tell us what more can be done to encourage people to join us in Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection?
Yes, so we are looking very carefully at how we recruit, how we retain, and how we compensate. All three of those go to a variety of different areas where we have difficulty basically recruiting and hiring folks in those areas. So we're looking at rotations, we're looking at bonuses, we're looking at additional educational opportunities so they can get training along the way.
Secretary Nielsen, if I can just say, because I don't have a lot of time left, and he's wielding a pretty heavy gavel today. I've been hearing this for 6 years. I just want to see it. I want to see, what that plan is, and I want to hear from my guys up in the border, my men and women up in the border, that yes, they're being heard, they're being listened to, and that their job rewards have increased as a result of the recognition from the Department of Health.
Happy to come brief you. The good news is, for the first time in many, many, many years, we are hiring at a rate that outpaces the rate at which we are losing. Yes, ma'am. So, but happy to come brief you in detail. Understand.
Senator Harris.
Thank you. Director Wray, I want to thank you and the men and women of your agency for the work you do every day. I think I'm the only member of this committee who is also a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I'd like to talk with you about the Kavanaugh hearings. So I just want to be clear about how the system works. When the FBI was given the direction to do the background investigation as it related to Dr. Ford's allegations, that's an instruction that goes to the FBI from the White House. Is that correct? Not from the Senate?
That's correct.
And when the FBI was directed then to do that investigation as it relates to those specific allegations, was the FBI given full discretion, or was the scope of the investigation limited by the direction you received from the White House?
Well, Senator, I want to be a little bit careful about what I can talk about in this setting.
So I'm clear. I'm not asking you for the content of the investigation,
understood,
just the process. Understood.
There are MOUs and other things that go back a ways that govern this, but I think it's important, I would say this, it's important to understand that unlike most investigations, like the sort that you and I and Senator Jones have all been familiar with, traditional criminal investigations, national security investigations, a background investigation is very different. And that is done, our only authority is as requested by the adjudicating agency. The
White House
in this case is the White House.
And I have a lot to cover, and so if we can be as succinct as possible, I appreciate it. And I know there are a lot of details, and I appreciate your point. So in this situation, was your direction limited in scope, or were you given full discretion to investigate whatever your agency thought was appropriate to figure out what happened?
I think I would say that our investigation here, our supplemental update to the previous background investigation was limited in scope, and that is consistent with the standard process for such investigations going back quite a long ways.
And did you receive this directive in writing?
There's been lots of communication between, as is standard, between the FBI's Security Division and the White House's Office of Security.
Was it in writing?
And I would expect that there would be written communications, but I can't speak to that here.
Can you find the direction and provide it to this committee, the documents?
I would have to see what would be appropriate.
Okay. And who from the White House communicated the directive?
Well, as I said, the communication between the FBI and the White House for nominations, including judicial nominations, is through the FBI's Security Division, which has background investigation specialists, and the White House Office of Security. And that's where the communication always is. And I've spoken with our background investigation specialists, and they have assured me that this was handled in the way that is consistent with their experience and the standard process.
Did anyone in your agency receive any direction about the scope of the investigation directly from Don McGahn?
Well, I can't speak to what anybody throughout the organization might have received instructions on. My understanding is that the communications occurred between the White House's Office of Security and the FBI Security Division.
Do you know who determined that the FBI would not interview Judge Kavanaugh or Dr. Ford or the list of 40-plus witnesses?
Again, I would say what I said at the beginning, which is, as is standard, the investigation was very specific in scope, limited in scope, and that is the usual process, and that my folks have assured me that the usual process was followed.
Okay. And did the FBI look into allegations as to whether Judge Kavanaugh lied to Congress during his testimony?
That's not something I could discuss here.
Okay. Thank you. Secretary Nielsen. Senator Peters, during this committee hearing, asked how long is too long to detain a child, and you went on to testify that your agency does not detain children. However, it appears that there is some conflict then between your understanding and what the IG reported in September of 2018, when in that report, which I have here, and I'm sure you've read it, there was a finding that CBP held children separated from their parents for extended periods of time in facilities intended solely for short-term detention, despite assertions by you that children were being transferred to HHS within 72 hours, as is statutorily required. For example, in the Rio Grande Valley sector, 27% of children were in CBP custody for more than 5 days, and in the El Paso sector, 23% of children were in CBP custody for more than 5 days. And in one case, in the Rio Grande sector, I believe a child was held in CBP custody for 25 days. How do you reconcile the testimony you provided this committee with the report from the IG?
So I think there's two separate topics. The one that you were describing is when we apprehend a family unit, or what you're talking about is an unaccompanied child, we, as soon as possible, process that child, which means we give them initial medical screen. We ascertain if they have family members as best we can in the United States. Where
but Secretary, I just have a minute left.
Okay.
You testified that you don't detain children.
We do
the
not.
IG report indicates that
we do
CBP,
not have,
which is, I'm not finished. The IG report indicates that CBP has detained children, and not only has CBP detained children, they've detained them for longer than is statutorily allowed. How do you reconcile the IG report with your testimony this morning?
We do not detain children. What we do is when we apprehend them at a Border Patrol station, we process them, and as soon as there is room in an HHS facility, we transfer them. Because of the
So does the processing involve detention?
It's not detention facility.
Do they stay in CBP custody? Do they spend the night there?
We are not able to, under the law, put them anywhere else, so we will care for them until bed space opens at a detention facility at HHS.
In other words, you do detain children.
In other words, we do not have enough detention facility at HHS because 10,000 children were sent here unaccompanied, and their parents chose to do that.
Thank you.
Senator Paul.
Secretary Nielsen, you're a member of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS.
Yes, sir.
Earlier this year, CFIUS intervened to block Broadcom from acquiring Qualcomm because of national security concerns. Now Broadcom is about to complete acquisitions of Computer Associates Technologies, also known as CA Technologies, whose network systems are deeply embedded in many of our critical infrastructure facilities and national security agencies. For example, 60% of U.S. electric companies are serviced by companies using CA systems. Similarly, their systems are used in 29 U.S. nuclear reactors. Is CFIUS reviewing this transaction between Broadcom buying CA Technologies?
Sir, in this forum, I can't speak to open investigations, but happy to come talk to you about it.
Okay. We will send you a letter advocating that CFIUS look at this, and whatever can be public, that's fine. But we think that if they were looking at Broadcom previously, just because Broadcom has changed their domicile to here doesn't mean we still shouldn't look at Broadcom. Director Wray, does the FBI access the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Database for information on domestic crime?
The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Database? I mean, we have a variety of databases. We do not investigate domestic crime through our FISA authorities.
That would seem to contradict things that we've heard previously. You're saying that the FBI does not access any of the foreign databases, either the 12333 or the FISA database, looking at domestic crime.
Well, maybe you and I are using slightly different definitions of the term domestic crime. I think we use the foreign intelligence authorities that we have and the foreign intelligence databases that we have to investigate counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and cyber activity on behalf of foreign actors. Are there situations where some of those programmatic areas then result in criminal charges that are statutes that could also be domestic crimes? Absolutely.
But you're telling me that a guy that is alleged to sell drugs and talks to people in Mexico whose conversations might be caught up in an international database, you're not accessing those to go after drug charges?
Senator, I'd be happy to try to arrange a more detailed briefing that could get
No, but that's either a yes or a no. Either you do it or you don't do it. In the past, my understanding is the FBI has said that they do this, that they do access, and that's been a big debate over what the legislation should say on what you should do. And in the recent FISA reform, we actually said you can only do it or that it requires a warrant if you have an open and active investigation. The point from those of us who believe we need more privacy control is that we're concerned that the FBI, thousands of agents across the country, could be looking at conversations about domestic crime or about anything, perhaps, without a warrant. And that's the debate we've been having for years in this country, and this is a public policy debate, not one over secrets. So your testimony is that the FBI does not access foreign databases to investigate in any way domestic crime.
Senator, I would want to be more careful in my answer to you, so let me propose to get back to you with something in writing on that.
The reason this is a debate is that when we collect information on people overseas, we don't use the Constitution. We don't believe necessarily that the Constitution applies to you if you live in Libya. So we scoop up all your information. We listen to phone calls everywhere, including Angela Merkel, everybody. We listen to everybody's phone calls around the world. And so, but we tend to tolerate that, but we have the Constitution for those of us in the United States. So if you happen to catch someone talking on the phone, so for example, do you think that it's possible that the president's conversations with international leaders are in the FISA database?
I'm not sure there's anything I could speak to in this setting.
It's been reported in the Washington Post about 2 years ago. There were 1,500 times in which the president, this was when Obama was president, was minimized, meaning that, yes, you are gathering up so much information, you, the NSA, the intelligence community, that actually the president's conversations are gathered up in there. Do you think it's possible that members of Congress are in the FISA database if we talk to international leaders?
Well, Senator, I am quite confident that we are conducting ourselves in a manner consistent with the law and the Constitution and subject to extensive oversight. I don't know that I could speak to every hypothetical about whether or not there have been situations.
Do you think it's possible that journalists' conversations, if they're talking with international journalists overseas, or if they mention that they're doing a story on el-Baghdadi or another terrorist name, do you think that there's a possibility that journalist conversations are in the FISA database?
I can't speak to specific hypotheticals. I think
the answer is yes. And do you think it's a possibility that international businessmen and women who are having conversations with people overseas could be caught up in your database as well?
Senator, as I said, I am confident that the FBI is adhering to its authorities in a manner consistent with the law passed by the Congress and the Constitution.
The problem is while the FBI, by and large, is full of good people, yourself included, you have had some bad apples. You had Peter Strzok and his girlfriend talking about trying to bring the president down. You've had people bringing their politics to work. The concern of us who want more control over what you do and how you look at data is that, as Madison said, men are not angels. That's why we have the Constitution. That's why we ask you to get a warrant. The information you've gathered in the foreign database is not constitutional in the sense that it's gathered with no bar. There is no warrant. There is no constitutional manner to that data. And yet you're going to then use it on domestic crime. That has been our complaint for years and years and years, that you should not be allowed to access that data without a warrant. Why? Because we don't want Peter Strzok and his girlfriend down there looking up Republican donors or conservative donors. We want there to be controls. And it's not to say that most people are bad apples. I think 99% of the people at the FBI are good people. But the 1 or 2% that become Peter Strzok's or Andy McCabe's or abuse their authority down there need to have the control of the Constitution. That's why we continue to argue that these FISA databases, any of these foreign databases, that if you're going to look in them, if you have an FBI agent in Omaha and he or she's going to look at the database, into any of these databases, they should call a judge and get a warrant. That way we don't allow bias to enter into this. This has been, from the beginning of time, the protections we want, and I don't think it's being taken adequately. Thank you.
Senator, I would just say that I disagree with the characterization of it as being unconstitutional in terms of the way in which we've conducted ourselves, but I appreciate your kind words about the men and women of the FBI. I would say that the recent legislation that was passed by this Congress was important legislation to keep Americans safe, and I think we can protect the American people and uphold the Constitution at the same time, and I think that's what we're doing.
Senator Langford.
Thank you to all three of you and the teams that work around you. You've some pretty remarkable folks that are engaged in this, and so we appreciate the ongoing work that you have. Secretary Nielsen, let me start with you. There were some questions that came up on a Bloomberg article just a few days ago about supply chains and the accusation that China, as a government, from the article itself, was working with individuals within manufacturing to put microchips into motherboards that would then get access to all parts of communication and all parts of the American government, including national defense resources. Talk to me about DHS and what you're doing on supply chain management and trying to be able to help protect us from foreign threats.
So this is a particularly pernicious threat, as you well know, because it's very difficult for the average citizen, company, or government entity to understand every component that was put into a part or piece of equipment or network that they've purchased. So at DHS, we've created the National Risk Management Center. Under that center, we have a Information Communications Technology Task Force on supply chain. We're working very closely with the private sector to break down the supply chain and give them much more awareness on the types of companies they're purchasing from. We provide them intelligence with respect to whether those companies could pose a threat. And certainly within DHS, I have asked for a complete overhaul in the way in which we look at contracting to make sure that any vendor that works with DHS is complied with basic security. We also, as you know, have used our binding operational directive when needed in the case of Kaspersky to make sure that that is removed off of all federal networks.
So at this point, as you're working with entities, is there a greater threat from manufacturing? Let's say in this case it was from China that's deliberately trying to be able to gain access to information and the movement of information in the United States. Is there a greater threat from China than there has been historically? Is that a growing threat? How would you describe that?
I would echo Director Wray's description of China. They're bringing everything they have to bear. They're playing a long game. They're trying to influence us in every way possible. We do see them very active in the cyberspace. So we take that intel from the intel community, and then we appropriately share it with the private sector to make sure that they're up to speed on the tactics, threat indicators, et cetera, that might apply.
Thank you. Director Wray, how are the airports doing in working with you? You have a voluntary cooperation with the airports to be able to help check for insider threats. How are airports working with the FBI? Are they actively engaging with the FBI? Or you see the vast majority of airports saying we want to do that? Obviously, TSA are very aggressive on trying to be able to work for insider threats, but there's lots of other employees that are there. The majority of airports voluntarily cooperating with you or not?
I would say in general, Senator, that the airports have been good partners with us. Obviously, we work very closely with the various DHS agencies in dealing with airport security. But I would say for the most part, we have had pretty good cooperation from the airports.
So for airports that have chosen not to cooperate with you, and there are several that have said, you know, we've got it, we'll do our own, what would be the counsel that you would provide to them?
I think this is a shared fight, a shared threat, and requires a shared response.
Thank you.
Secretary Nielsen, let me go back to immigration. You have a very difficult task. It's been interesting to be able to hear the dialogue around this dais today. When you have thousands and thousands of kids that are coming at you, that you're trying to be able to manage and care for, which foreign leaders have come to the United States to be able to look at the facilities specifically to see how their kids are taken care of and have walked away impressed, saying, okay, our kids are being well cared for. They have an understanding from those governments that these individual kids or these families have crossed the border illegally. They've crossed thousands of miles. They've slept on the open ground and dirt and not had access to good food, not had access to shelter, have been moved by human smugglers. Then they come to the United States and they're treated with dignity. They're put in a place. They're provided food, they're provided shelter, they're provided safety that they've not had, several of them for weeks and weeks and weeks of travel. It's a very different experience. So it's interesting to me to hear the note and the accusation to you as you're detaining children when you're actually trying to be able to manage and provide care to kids that have not had care, sometimes from their own parents, sometimes at all from anyone for weeks at that point. So I do appreciate what you're doing. You're putting a positive face forward for America to be able to help provide care for kids that are in a vulnerable moment. So I appreciate that. I also appreciate what you're doing working with the Northern Triangle and with Mexico. Can you help me understand where that's going? Because I know there's a lot of dialogue right now with the Northern Triangle. This Congress has voted 3 years in a row to put over $600 million towards helping stabilize Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. 3 years in a row, $600 million each year plus to be able to fight corruption, provide judicial stability there, to be able to help fight off drug interdictions and such, to be able to help. You're also engaging at a different level. Help me understand that.
Happy to. So there's quite a few components that go into it, as you know. So working directly with the 3 countries in the Northern Triangle and Mexico and Colombia, Costa Rica, other countries in the region, I have asked us to work on a regional approach to counter smuggling. The smuggling epidemic is not a United States problem, it's not a Mexican problem, and it's not a Northern Triangle problem. We all have to work together to dismantle that. So that's part one. Part two is making sure that the countries from which they originate are as stable as possible, that they provide health, care, food in some cases, but employment opportunities. The more and more that we have dug into this over the last year in conjunction with the United Nations, what we have found is the vast majority of those leaving the Northern Triangle leave for family reunification, leave for an economic opportunity, and then in some cases, in some areas, leave for a lack of food security. So we're working with the United Nations to increase asylum capacity so that we can take care of those vulnerable populations who do choose to leave as close as possible to that source of origin. I hope to be able to report to this committee soon some great strides forward with Mexico. I've been working very closely with the Peña Nieto administration, but also have had many conversations and trips to Mexico to meet with the López Obrador incoming administration. We have our conference later this week where we hope to focus on both building prosperity in the region with the NGO community and nonprofits, and also to focus on that security. How can we together as a region counter what we have, which is our common cause, which is against the smugglers, against the transnational criminal organizations and the gangs. So it's very complex, but we're pulling it all together to make sure we have a holistic approach.
Great. Thank you for that.
Senator Carper, are you ready?
Sorry to be bouncing back and forth. You know, we serve on a bunch of hearings and a bunch of committees, and I apologize for not being here for all of this one. I appreciate the interest, strong interest that Senator Lankford has shown in the Northern Triangle, and there's a reason why we have tens of thousands of people coming up from Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador. As you know, Madam Secretary, they have lived in too many cases lives of misery, and we're complicit in that misery because of our addiction to narcotics. Senator Lankford told me a few minutes ago before I left for another hearing that there's some progress in Guatemala just in the last week in terms of going after bad guys with respect to drug operations, and we applaud that. He and I are going to have a chance to talk to the President of Guatemala tonight at dinner, and there, while we applaud the work that's going on with respect to narcotics, strikes. Not so pleased with what's going on in some other regards. And I don't know how closely your predecessor, Jay Johnson, stayed very close to what was going on in the Northern Triangle. I don't know if you have a chance to do that or not, but if you had a chance to convey briefly a message to President Morales tonight with respect to progress or lack thereof in terms of working through the Alliance for Prosperity to actually turn the country around and improve things, what message would you give him?
Sir, I'd go back to awareness. We have to work together to protect these vulnerable populations. It cannot be that their only option is to pay a smuggler. So the more that he can do to work with us, and I do stay very involved, I probably spend about 40% of every working day on Mexico and the Northern Triangle to try to work on the push factors and help stabilize the region. But the more that he can help us with awareness and help us work towards other options, I do think that that will monumentally move us forward.
All right, thank you. One of the other hearings I came from, the Environment and Public Works hearing, which focuses on today on endangered species of all things. But one of our witnesses has just shared with us that her husband's heading for Mobile has something to do with the storm that's bearing down, and they have realized another threat. One of the threats to our homelands, I think the greatest threat perhaps to our homelands, no one's talked about it today, but GAO's talked about it quite a bit in the last half dozen or so years. And that's the fact that our planet's getting warmer, and we're seeing extraordinary extreme weather happening. I think the cost, maybe just last year, for extreme weather events was about $300 billion. That's up dramatically from 10 years ago. We have, we measure rainstorms now, the amount of rain by the foot, not by the inch. We have parts of Montana, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, even California, where they're on fire. They've been on fire earlier this year. Places bigger than my state, a big state, I might add. And extreme weather they've had, I think, in the last 100 years, 33 Category 5 hurricanes in the whole Atlantic. In 100 years, 33. And last year, we've had 3 right here in the U.S. Something's going on here. And GAO says we better get our heads into the game. United Nations released a report just last week that said, better get our head into this game. And when you testified before us, Madam Secretary, I think I or somebody asked you a question about, do you think of this as a serious concern? And I think maybe you thought it was kind of a political question. We're trying to put you on the spot with your boss. And is this climate change real? And is there something we ought to be doing about it? But I just want to know, same question. When you think of threats to our country, to our homeland, what do you think about this threat?
I think it's very serious. As you said, just in 2017 alone, 15% of the United States population was affected by either a hurricane or a forest fire. So the intensity, the changes in weather patterns, the changes in which the hazards manifest, all require us to update everything we do. So first, I want to thank you very quickly for the legislative language I know this committee worked very hard on, which is to give us the ability to do pre-mitigation grants. I think that will really help to prepare areas. But we have to increase our modeling. We're working much more closely with NOAA, working much more closely with the Department of Interior, Department, USDA. We have to do more to anticipate and understand how these threats would manifest.
All right. I want to quote Mark Twain. Mark Twain once said, this goes back to some of our earlier conversation about truthfulness and that people understanding, like I think Senator Hassan raised the issue about faking identities and just deluding people and misleading people. But Mark Twain once said, "It ain't what people don't know that bothers me. It's what they know for sure that just ain't so." It just ain't so. Thomas Jefferson said it differently. He used to say, if the people know the truth, they won't make a mistake. If the people know the truth, they won't make a mistake. People don't know what's true anymore. We don't know it here. And my wife's been over in a couple of countries where, like Georgia, where they've gone through all kinds of attacks from the Russians. And people don't know what the truth is anymore. Let me just ask our FBI director, Mr. Wray, just think out loud about that, knowing the truth and this kind of situation we face as a nation today and the fact that it's hard to know what's true.
Senator, we think decisions need to be based on facts, and I think more and more this country could stand to everybody take a deep breath and calm down for a second and focus on the facts. And that's what we're going to do with the FBI.
I quote Jack Webb, who used to play Joe Friday, I think, on the FBI show many, many years ago. And he was famous for always saying he's going to someplace to do an investigation, knock on the door, and somebody would open the door. And he would say, whoever answered, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. And we don't know what the facts are this morning. Mr. Travers, you've not been asked a whole lot of questions. But if you were to just pick one question you would like to be asked, what would that question be?
What's your single biggest concern about the terrorist threat going forward?
Good. Could you answer that question?
My answer will be
That's a great question, by the way.
Complacency. You know, I was like...
People are always saying to us when we ask questions, they say, well, thank you for that question. So I'll thank you for your question.
Sir, I was wondering if I was going to get out of here with just one question today. And
no way.
A few years ago, your predecessors, our predecessors, it would have been all terrorism all the time. One question, I'm not complaining at all. I think it's reflective of all the very good work that's been done on your side of the dais, on our side of the dais. The country is much safer because of our counterterrorism efforts. But as I said in my opening statement, there are concerns and there are really hard challenges that implicate policy and law, I believe, that we need to address because, frankly, the bad guys are moving faster than we are. And so I do worry about taking our eye off the ball a little bit. There are much more, there are really hard national security challenges we have to address, and they have supplanted terrorism to a degree, but we need to be careful.
All right, thanks. Thanks so much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hoven.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Nielsen, first I want to thank you for coming to North Dakota, for your visit to the Grand Forks Air Force Base to see your CBP facility there. We think Director of the CBP, Kevin McAleenan's doing a fine job. And also seeing our Grand Sky Technology Park. As you know, we were able to pass the Preventing Emerging Threats legislation led by this committee, and I want to thank both the chairman and ranking member for their work on it. I was pleased to be part of that legislation. We talked about how it was important legislation that you needed to counter UAS threats. Now that that legislation is, we've moved that legislation, can you tell me where you are in terms of standing up that effort, both as far as what additional authorities you might need, what your plan is to stand up and make sure that we have that counter UAS security both at the border and internally in the country, and also how facilities like the facility you saw in Grand Forks can be part of that effort?
Well, sir, first and foremost, we have an implementation plan we've been working on for some time in anticipation of receiving the authority. We look forward to briefing you at your convenience and interest on the details of that. At this time, we do not believe we need any additional authority. We, again, I started by thanking, let me do it again. I really appreciate the leadership of everyone on this committee. It makes a tremendous difference to know that when we have an emerging threat, we can quickly work with Congress and get legislation we need. What I would say is as we look towards research and development, and that is certainly an area that the facility that we visited North Dakota could be very helpful with. But as we look towards research and development and look towards testing applications within civilian environments, it might be in that case that then we need to come back and talk in greater detail about how we can apply those. There are a lot of appropriate reporting requirements in the legislation beginning in 6 months. What I'd like to do is come much sooner and talk with members who are interested about how we intend to use this. DOJ was also granted the authority, as you know. Their applications are slightly different than ours, but I believe that our general countermeasures and approach would be very similar. So I look forward to continuing to work with you on that.
As I think you're aware, I'm also on DHS on the approach side. Is there other funding requirements, or in general, are you where you need to be to stand up this effort, both in terms of authority and appropriation?
At the moment, we are where we need to be, but I would like to just quickly morph to the flip side of drones, which is the positive use. As you know, up in your area, we use drones, and we use that as an area to launch our drones, in particular to help us secure the northern border. We have 9 that we use right now, Predator drones, but as we move forward, we'd like to continue to work with you on how to expand our capability set with that use.
Well, and necessarily so. Grand Forks, just for example, 900
100 miles of border responsibility all the way from the as you know, from the Great Lakes on the east all the way out through most of the beautiful state of Montana. That's a long stretch, and we need drones to truly cover all that area. We are focused on the southern border, and obviously need to be, but we have tremendous expanses with a lot of different terrain, lakes, mountains, plains, all of that on the northern border. So I think this is a very critical part of our effort, and we want to work with you on it. And again, I appreciate you coming out and taking a look. And as you know, we now have beyond visual line of sight authority there as well. So thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Director Wray, how are we staying ahead of some of the cyber challenges, your cyber security? You know, we always think of your field agents and how tremendous they are. But how about your technology, your cyber, staying ahead of the technology that you face, including cyber hacks and that kind of thing on the FBI?
So thank you, Senator. This is something that we spend an enormous amount of time on, as you would imagine. We have cyber task forces, as you alluded to, in all 56 field offices. And I think one of the things people don't fully appreciate about those task forces is that they have about 184 other agencies that have task force officers on our cyber task forces. We also have a cyber action team, which is a sort of elite rapid deployment task force that we send out depending on the incident. We have cyber ALATs, which are assistant legal attaches in our foreign offices, and we are trying to partner more and more with the private sector. One of the things that I think is a real challenge for law enforcement generally is the need to improve the digital proficiency, the cyber proficiency through the profession. We just can't recruit enough cyber whiz kids who also have all the other qualities that you and I would both want in law enforcement. And so we're really focused on trying to improve the training that we can provide so that we can make sure our workforce is truly digitally savvy. And that's a big focus of emphasis, and we certainly will be using all the help we can get from Congress to enhance that.
Director Travers, I am going to make sure you get some more questions. In regard to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and those types of organizations, we're defeating them on the battlefield. How are we doing it, both tracking them in terms of their efforts on the Internet, countering their efforts on the Internet, and then making sure that we're tracking somebody who may become radicalized in this country and countering that threat?
Sir, it's amongst the largest questions, problems that we have.
And I want your evaluation of how well we're doing it, and are we on top of it?
As the strategy that came out last week indicated, we have to do far better in the full range of non-kinetic measures, and radicalization on the Internet is certainly one of them. We have come a long ways, I think, in the last few years. The private sector, the social media companies are much more willing to work with us than they were. They take down lots of people and lots of content. We're increasingly getting into difficult questions. There would be no agreed upon definition of quote unquote terrorist content, and that gets into free speech in a hurry. But we are making progress. I think the conversation is far more sophisticated, far healthier. I was in Europe last week on this very issue. A lot of concerns within the EU on how well this is or isn't going. It's going to be a large challenge for us going forward because as the terrorists get younger, they're getting better at this, and it poses massive issues for the intelligence community and law enforcement.
As Director Wray brought up, are you able to get the, whiz kids, if you will, the people with the cyber training and talent that you need? Are you able to attract those people?
Well, generally speaking, data scientists are amongst the most difficult individuals for us to attract and retain because they're in huge demand across the private sector.
And so we need to be looking at more ways to attract and retain that type of talent, don't we?
And we're investigating everything from bonuses for retention. Yeah.
Thank you.
Senator Daines, this is, by the way, the first time I have an opportunity to congratulate you on being the father of the bride. I'm sure that was a little bit more public than you had initially intended, but I hope you had a good day on Saturday. But take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was a great day. Appreciate that. Secretary Nielsen, Director Wray, Acting Director Travers, thanks for coming up the hill today before this committee. Secretary Nielsen, it's good to see you again. And I want to thank you for your leadership at DHS. There's been a lot of talk this morning about what needs to be improved, but I also think we should take a moment to recognize truly the great work that you and the men and women at DHS do in keeping our country safe every day, 24 hours a day. We need to secure our borders. The senator from North Dakota mentioned the long northern border that we have from Montana. It's nearly 550 miles. Put that in perspective, it's going from here to Indianapolis, round numbers. It's a great distance. And I appreciate that President Trump has made it clear that we're going to secure our borders. It's a difficult task, but I want to thank you for executing against that mission. As we think about securing our borders, it's a critical first step, certainly, in stemming illegal immigration, but it's also the drugs that pour into our country. And remarkably, we had this discussion last week in this very room, we don't know how many citizens we have in our country, let alone how many millions of illegal immigrants are here. Dr. Dillingham was here last week. We talked about we don't ask that question of citizenship on the census form. Many of these illegal immigrants are harbored in sanctuary cities. This is a direct threat to public safety. Frankly, it's a blatant disregard to the rule of law. In 2018, ICE Homeland Security investigations have led to the seizure of nearly 60,000 pounds of meth so far. That totals nearly $500 million. In fact, 26,000 pounds of heroin with a street value over $700 million were also seized. These are huge amounts. It's also a testament to the work that you are doing. Yet some of these drugs make it to Montana. They come up through the southern border. They make it to Montana. And in Montana, we are facing a meth and opioid epidemic. In fact, lives, families, neighborhoods are being destroyed. Last week, the Senate passed an opioids package. I fought to include the Mitigating Meth Act that expands the state-targeted response to the opioid crisis grants to include Indian tribes as eligible recipients. Additionally, the STOP Act was included, which helps stop illegal drugs from coming in at the border or being shipped through the Postal Service. Secretary Nielsen, my question is, what steps can DHS take to better prevent these drugs from reaching and directly impacting Montana communities?
Well, sir, first of all, in the interest of time, let me just say happy to give you a much more in-depth brief because there's so many answers to this question. But we start with international partnerships and international cooperation. So everyone from Interpol to Europol to all of the countries south of us, to include China when it comes to fentanyl. So work with them on at the law enforcement to law enforcement. We use interagency task force, such as that out of Key West or out of South, to track the shipments, the ships that are loaded with drugs as they approach our borders, and we work with all elements of the USG to interdict them. When they get to the border, we have the Coast Guard, we have TSA if they're coming in through land, we have CBP, and what we work in that case in a targeted way to locate parcels or packages that might be of concern. We use non-intrusive detection equipment at the border to actually scan cars, et cetera. Once they get into the country, the next level of security is we work with local law enforcement. We work with different elements of the Department of Justice to include DEA. And we try to take down the whole entire network. So ICE has the Cybercrime Center. We look a lot about marketplaces on the dark web, how to take them down, how to remove the opportunity to sell that way. We also then do a lot of sharing once we have targeted information with state and local law enforcement so that they know it's there. When it comes to the mail, I mentioned before, very appreciative of passage through this body of the STOP Act. We need that. CBP has trained all of its canines. We do targeting, but we need to work with the post office to make sure that all of that mail is scanned. So we try to do a comprehensive way before it ever gets to the borders, at the borders, internal to the United States, in the mail, and then working with state and locals to take it down at that level.
Secretary Nielsen, thank you. I want to take it up to a little 30,000-foot view here. In your opening statement, you noted one of the greatest threats to Homeland today is the evolving nature of threats themselves. to include increasingly coordinated and sophisticated criminal activity. Specifically, as you assess threats, what do you believe are the top 2 to 3 greatest threats to the homeland as you look out over the next 12 to 24 months?
So I would say in general that what concerns me the most are these evolving threats because they are evolving and emerging so quickly. So in some cases when we need additional authorities, we will come to you. Again, appreciate all the efforts of this committee to meet our needs. But there's still a gap because, for example, even with drones, I now have the authority. But before I had the authority, I couldn't even do the research and development to develop the countermeasures to then apply them. So we have to narrow that gap in terms of when we see an emerging threat, fighting it. The transnational criminal organizations are taking all their crime online. They're inventing new crimes online. One that I find to be particularly abhorrent, and I'm working with my international colleagues on, is the instance of live abuse. This is the situation where abusers can watch a child being abused online and give directions real time to the abuser to abuse that child. This is a very difficult crime to investigate, but we have to do more. So we see a proliferation of new and emerging crimes through not just the internet, but through very complex, I mean, these are now decentralized cartels, essentially. So they have middlemen that are in common, but we are trying to move away from a whack-a-mole approach and dismantle the entire network.
Think about these criminal activities. At what point do they become a homeland security risk?
I believe that's now, sir.
As we think about lone wolf as well as homegrown extremists, what threshold must be crossed or what trigger tripped to invoke authorities and resources beyond what law enforcement agencies have organically?
From a DHS perspective, and we work very closely with the FBI, as the director mentioned, both on domestic terrorists as well as homegrown violent extremists. Hate is hate, violence is violence. What we've done at DHS is we've changed our programs to focus on the prevention of all terrorism through partnerships. So we do that through information sharing, we do that through awareness, we do that through counter narratives, we do that through counter radicalization, but we try to have a holistic approach. But I think what's important there to realize is we don't want to get to the point where a threshold has been crossed. We need to have a holistic approach to counter those narratives so that no one is radicalized.
Thank you, Secretary Nielsen.
Thank you, Senator Daines. Mr. Travers, I was also going to let you exercise your vocal cords. And by the way, in my introduction, I wasn't trying to point out your age. I was trying to point out your really length of extraordinary public service. I want to put the study of terrorism, response to terrorism chart back up there, and just kind of want you to comment. Again, I realize there are problems with the data here, but I was shocked, quite honestly, to take a look at the 2017 results. Can you just typify what all's happened? You know, this shows some measure of success. Of course, any death due to terrorism is one too many, but there's some progress being made. Can you just speak to that?
A little bit, sir. So up through 2012 or so, NCTC maintained the database that supported the State Department's country reports on terrorism. We got out of the business for budgetary reasons. And so that data is now, I think, largely produced by the University of Maryland. They have had issues with the way they compile data. I think, but I cannot prove, that the very large bars are almost certainly Iraq-Syria related. And so you have to be careful in terms of what it is you're counting. I mean, we used to focus on how many individuals were killed by VBIEDs, for instance. I suspect some of this is large-scale insurgency, but I don't know.
Okay, so the good news is we've certainly helped solve the problem in Iraq and Syria, but that isn't to say that the threat's gone away. It's metastasized, it's spread, and we're just kind of seeing the normal level of threat now because we have those more unusual circumstances.
That's correct, and there is some good news, I think, in terms of HVE attacks in Europe are down from where they were last year. Probably that's partly because the resonance with the demise of the caliphate has declined. It's partly because we're seeing vast improvements in European efforts to share information and crack down on crime and terrorism. So there is good news, to be sure.
So one of the solutions, obviously, is sharing information, awareness, just public awareness, which brings me into my next line of questioning for either or both of the Director or the Secretary. Bloomberg has, I think, done an excellent job of investigative report on the supermicro, the implantation of small little microchips into these boards. I know Apple is denying it. Follow-on report seems like it's pretty sound reporting. Without getting into the specifics of that, unless you want to speak to whether it is true or not, what went through my mind immediately is how come I'm finding out from Bloomberg and not in terms of contact from the federal government? We earlier had, we were made aware of Kaspersky Labs. I didn't find out about it. Fortunately, we have a couple committee members that serve on the Intelligence Committee, and they were being briefed on it. But Kaspersky Labs was in business for a decade or more, becoming a larger and larger business, fully integrating themselves into our supply chain, to our personal computers, and we did nothing. Again, my point being, I think one of our best lines of defense against cyber attacks is just exposure. I mean, the fact that we have these high-profile attacks, whether it's Sony or Target, or I won't list all of them, that has literally brought the IT guy out of the basement and at the CEO level. It's incredibly important to have public exposure. I think we have a huge problem of overclassification and lack of notice. So, again, I just kind of like to ask both of you, when did you find out about the whole situation with Supermicro and this implantation of chips in the supply chain?
Well, I would say, as to the newspaper article or the magazine article, I would just say be careful what you read in this context. Certainly, I would say that I agree with you 1,000%, Mr. Chairman, that awareness is a huge part of the defense to whether it's supply chain risks or cyber risks. And we are and I also agree with you that there's an overclassification issue that sometimes affects that. I think that's sometimes a little bit of a red herring, because one of the things we've gotten better at doing in terms of raising awareness, in terms of victim notification, in terms of reaching out to, say, the private sector, victim companies, public sector, when those agencies are affected, is in some cases we can do briefings where we have non-disclosure agreements and things like that, but we're trying to get a lot more creative in how we can get information out sooner, because I think there's a recognition that there are way too many attacks and way too many threats for us to be able to investigate all of them, so we have to be able to get into the prevention business.
And by the way, so if this is not accurate, I would like to have the FBI or somebody come out and say it's not, because we also don't want false information out there as well. I mean, does that make sense? Or what prevents us from doing that?
Well, I can't speak for other agencies. On our end, we have to be very careful because we have very specific policy that apply to us as law enforcement agencies to neither confirm nor deny the existence of an investigation.
Okay, so I guess I'm looking at Secretary Nielsen then.
But I do want to be careful that my comment not be construed as inferring or implying, I should say, that there is an investigation. We take very seriously our obligation to notify victims when they've been targeted.
But again, so much of cyber defense is threat identification, notification, right?
Yes, sir. And we have adopted a shine the light approach. I mean, we have to stop the complacency and move to attribution and consequences. So one of the first things we did do was the binding operational directive against Kaspersky. Can't speak to why it wasn't done sooner. With respect to the article, we at DHS do not have any evidence that supports the article. We have no reason to doubt what the companies have said. We continue to look into it. What I can tell you, though, is it is a very real and emerging threat that we are very concerned about. So we are working very closely with the private sector, within our federal family, and certainly to put our own house in order to make sure that we are locking down every step of that supply chain.
Before I go into another series of questions, quickly with you, Secretary Nielsen, you've issued now a strategy on EMP, GMD. Can you just quick summarize it? I mean, what is the primary finding out of that?
The primary finding is, and you will not be surprised to hear me say this, sir, but that we need to do more. So we are starting with the energy sector and the communications sector. We need to do much greater depth of modeling to understand what the actual cascading effects would be. As you and I have discussed, in an extreme, if all of the lights go out and we have a long-term power outage, we do have an annex for that as part of our federal interagency operational planning under the National Response Framework. So regardless of cause, we can respond and recover. But the cause is very important, and understanding exactly how that will emanate is important. Also within that is research and development. We need to do some research and development to protect critical infrastructure systems and networks.
This is certainly one of those problems that we've been admiring for years. I am really looking to do something, and my suggestion always has been, what do we do if the electrical grid goes down, regardless of the cause, whether it's kinetic, whether it's cyber, whether it's EMP, GMD, and maybe we start there. Large power transformers have no replacements. I mean, I really am looking for action and an action plan to do something so we can mitigate any kind of damage. I have some more questions, but want to turn to Senator McCaskill, and then I'll go back.
Secretary Nielsen, ports of entry where 90% of the seizures of fentanyl are made, your 4,000 officers, well, to be specific, 3,908 officers short of your own staffing model. But yet, and I've discussed this before, your department has not requested more for this. Do you agree that you're not adequately staffed at the ports of entry for the interdiction of fentanyl?
As you know, Senator, it's a combination. So first of all, to the extent that we have openings, we have open positions, we have to fill them. And we're working very hard to do that. As I mentioned previously, we're finally at a point where bringing folks onto duty, the number is now above the number that we're losing through attrition. So that's step one. Step two, it's that combination of technology. So what we've also done is we're cross-training some of the folks that we do have at those ports of entry so that they're all trained, for example, on the equipment. They can serve multiple positions. But if the basis of your question is, do we need to do more at the ports of entry to stop drugs, the answer is yes.
In May, you said there's no suggestion you have a lack of people to work with the canines or run the machine when you were here. The Inspector General, as you know, issued a report on September 24th that said, in fact, the lack of personnel is at the heart of the issue. I'm quoting the report now. It's inadequate to prevent illegal drugs and contraband from entering the United States. In addition to finding that they lack the resources and staffing, they also found that the targeting of packages that we are now doing has a very limited impact. Frankly, limited is a kind word because it found that we are only targeting 0.01% of the packages for inspection. What is your sense of whether or not you can immediately begin to up the number in terms of because that is so minimal. The chances of us really uncovering how much fentanyl is coming in is very limited. I introduced a bill earlier this year to hire more officers at our points of entry and mail facilities. And we can add the technology, but if we don't have enough people to run it, it doesn't do any good. Can you give me any sense of your sense of urgency on this?
The sense of urgency is high, first of all. What we are doing, and that's what I was trying to reference, so what we've done, first of all, is we've taken personnel that had a very limited role, and we've expanded their role so that everyone at the port of entry, part of the problem with the equipment is there's only a very small part of that force that was trained on the equipment. So we have fixed that or are starting to fix that. With respect to the targeting, we're increasing our targeting. A lot of that comes from the intel community. So we are strengthening partnerships there, doing more dot connecting, to use Director Travers' language. And with respect to the packages, there's a couple different ways we do that. If it's a package, vice a car, vice a person, the dogs play a role, canines play a role. Secondary inspections are much higher, as you know, in terms of pulling a car over, and we constantly find drugs in cars through the non-intrusive injection equipment. But what I'd love to do is come and touch you more about it and kind of walk through.
Yeah, because I'd like us to get on the same page about what you need.
Understand.
You know, I think, honestly, I'm going to be candid here. I think there has been so much political attention around border security and in Americans' minds, and I think, frankly, in the president's mind. He sees this as agents along the border, all across the southern border. And because there's been all that political attention there, there's been very little attention directed to this real vital need that we have. We are dying from this fentanyl in record numbers all across my state. families. I talk to families every week, Madam Secretary, who've lost a child to fentanyl, illegal fentanyl. And the sad thing about this is we could do this. We know how to interdict. I can guarantee you that the director of the FBI can certainly tell you that we know how to interdict. We just not have put enough boots on the ground around this problem. And I think part of that is because it's the shiny object over here of, are we securing the entire southern border? I want to secure the border. I certainly do not want to shirk that responsibility, but I want to do this in a way that's smart and really is addressing the threat to our country. Finally, I wanted to ask you about the National Defense Authorization Act, where I was able to include a government-wide prohibition on the use of Kaspersky products and services. Are you in charge of overseeing the execution of this ban?
So we do it in conjunction with OMB and others within the government, but as you know, we do have point for federal networks. So from that perspective, we are still implementing our binding operational directive, which achieves, in some senses, the same goal.
Do you have data on the products and services that include the Kaspersky code?
We do have some data, yes, ma'am. We're happy to share that with you.
We'd like that. The legislation required that all Kaspersky products and services be removed from government systems by October 1st, 2018. Obviously, that date has passed. Did we meet that deadline? Have they been removed?
I do not have that information, but happy to get it to you today.
Okay, thank you.
So let me preface my next line of questions with a couple statements and a little history. First, I want to underscore what I think a number of members have already stated. We thank you for your service. We truly respect it. The men and women that you serve with, I mean, many of them putting their life on the line to keep this nation safe. I mean, we literally are in awe of their service and sacrifice. So, again, thank you for that. Secondly, in terms of this committee's history under my chairmanship with this next issue, we've been very restrained. Under our committee's jurisdiction is federal records. And when we saw the abuse of the email system in the State Department with Secretary Clinton, you know, we did a lot of oversight. 3 years worth of investigation, never held a hearing, wasn't interested in a show trial, just wanted to get to the bottom of it. After the election, when President Trump said, we're going to leave Secretary Clinton alone, we pretty well closed up shop and ended our investigation. And then the Peter Strzok, Lisa Page text appeared. And our investigation turned into an investigation of the FBI's investigation of the email scandal, and it's kind of morphed into the whole Russian investigation. There again, we were very patient. Relied on the Office of Inspector General. I think Michael Horowitz has done a great job, issued a great report. I read every page of it. After that report was issued, we chose, after 2 other committees, one Senate, one House, held a hearing. We didn't hold a hearing. A lot of my questions were answered, others weren't, and we followed up with an oversight letter. So again, I'm just trying to lay out basically how I've handled this thing, not trying to make no-show trials, just trying to get to the bottom of it. And so, Director Wray, my first question is, are you concerned about the credibility of the FBI? I actually have 3, credibility, integrity, and partiality. I'm not even going to ask impartiality and integrity because I think under your leadership, I know your answer. But what about the credibility? This is a legitimate concern. Are you concerned about that?
Well, Senator, I take the credibility of the FBI definitely seriously. I will tell you that I try to make sure that I'm focused on our credibility with the people who know us through our work. And when I get out and about, I've met with close to 3,000. And when I say meet, I'm not talking about speaking in a group. I'm talking about shake hands, talk to, meet. Close to 3,000 of the FBI's partners, federal, state, local, foreign. I've met with victims and their families. I've been to, I think, 43 of our 56 field offices. And what I find over and over and over and over again from the people who actually know the facts, back to the response I gave to Senator Carper, the credibility of the FBI is rock solid.
Again, that's the 99%. I'm talking about what we've seen over the last couple of years, okay, under Director Comey's leadership. I mean, Senator Paul touched on it to a certain extent. I mean, I can go through the list. Acting Director McCabe, the OIG report on that, which again was very detailed. He's under investigation. Now the Page Strzok text, the Rod Rosenstein memo about Director Comey. There's a number of reasons, legitimate concerns about what happened to the FBI? I mean, do you acknowledge that? And does that concern you?
Certainly, I take anybody's concern seriously. I think the Inspector General, as I agree with you, did a very thorough and professional job, and I've taken his recommendations very seriously. There have been disciplinary decisions, which I can't discuss in this forum, of course, that have been made. I expect our people to be held to the highest standards, all of them, all 37,000 of them, and I'm going to insist on that, but I'm going to insist on doing it by the book.
So we're also going to have an Office of Inspector General report on the leaks, which were very troubling in terms of what the initial OIG report on the Clinton investigation came. Who investigates the investigator? I mean, the FBI is a premier investigatory body of this nation. Who investigates the investigator?
Well, I think the short answer would be the Inspector General, which is outside of the FBI. When there have been instances where there has been misconduct by somebody at the FBI, which we're 110 years old, and we've had our share of bumps and bruises along the way. There's a reason why the Inspector General, which is, again, outside the FBI, has that authority.
Would there be another body that might investigate the investigator?
Besides the Inspector General? I think that would be the principal one that I would think of. They've done a very thorough job.
Let me suggest the principal one should be this body, Congress, which kind of gets me to my next line of question. I've sent to you, I would say, 5 primary letters of oversight. First of all, do you see those? Do you read those?
I am aware that, Mr. Chairman, that you've had a number of letters. I know we've produced thousands of pages, provide in-camera review of others. We do need to get better. Let me be clear. We need to get better at our responsiveness. We have lots and lots of requests from lots of different committees, but that's not an excuse. That's not an excuse.
Understand. One of the reasons I kind of laid out the history of this is I've been very restrained. I've really kept, by the way, I asked staff the kind of questions they want me to ask you. Here's their list. I'm not going through their list, okay? We've asked very pointed questions on some very pointed issues. It's the documents you're primarily giving us are the ones that you're giving us as a courtesy that have been requested by the House. I never asked for $1.2 million. I have 5 letters. 2 I have no response on. 3 I have partial response. I don't want to go all the way through those today, but what I do want to ask, will you commit to meeting with me to go over those oversight requests?
We'd be happy to sit down with you and see if we can get better in our responsiveness. I'm frustrated that you're frustrated.
Now, one of the outstanding suspicions is, all involved in terms of the FISA warrant. First, let me ask you, how many people in government have seen the unredacted FISA applications? Just a ballpark. Do you have any idea?
I really don't have that answer, sir.
It's probably dozens, right? Do you know that any member of Congress has actually looked at the unredacted FISA application?
Well, I know we have a classified reading room that certain members of the intelligence committees have had access to.
But I'm not.
But exactly what's in that and so forth, I don't know.
But I'm not allowed to see it, right? So I mean, there are some people in Congress that maybe have a little bit higher security clearance than somebody like myself or Senator McCaskill.
Well, again, I think we try very hard, the entire intelligence community, including the FBI, to balance both our need to be transparent and responsive to oversight, including this committee, but also to protect sources and methods. And I think there are ways to accommodate that. I think we've tried very hard to do that.
Okay, there is, again, you said, and we all want to protect sources and methods, okay? Nobody wants to put national security at risk. I think what we're seeing, and this is why you have a high level of suspicion, is it's more protecting the agency and some embarrassments in terms of some actions. So again, it's kind of like ripping off a Band-Aid. Why not rip off the Band-Aid? Why are we continuing to let this issue linger? Why not have full transparency?
Well, again, I think the topics that we're talking about are extremely sensitive intelligence operations. I understand the attraction of the rip off the Band-Aid approach, but I also understand that in many cases we're talking about situations that involve foreign partner relationships, tradecraft, and all kinds of other things that we need to be very careful about protecting.
So let me talk about something that has nothing but to do with foreign operations or tradecraft. We sent a letter, and I know other House committees have done as well, to get the memo from Andrew McCabe describing their meeting, his meeting with Rod Rosenstein and Lisa Page. Now, I've asked for, I think, a response date by October 15th. Will we get that memo?
Well, we'd have to get back to you on that. I will tell you that we also have an ongoing special counsel investigation.
Well,
that's
always,
not our.
Of course, that's always the problem, which is one of the reasons I did not agree with the special counsel at this point in time. It prevents the people's house, okay, the people's representatives from actually getting the truth and holding people accountable. It's as held up. I've been doing this now for 4 years as chairman, and every time there's a criminal investigation, Congress can't get information, and so the American people don't get information. You know, there were meetings, obviously, between Bruce Orr and FBI, so you have 302s probably produced on those. Is there any reason or rationale why we wouldn't be able to see those?
Well, again, as to any, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. So, as to any specific item, we're happy to take a look at it and see where it stands. I do know that, you know, part of the reason I can't answer specifically is that we've had so many oversight requests from so many different committees about so many different documents. But I do know that there is a very serious, ongoing criminal investigation that involves grand jury secrecy and the need to protect the integrity of that investigation. Whether the particular documents that you're asking for and the particular request run afoul of that, I'd have to have somebody take a look at it.
Okay, so I won't go any further, but will you make a commitment to set up a meeting with me where we can go through all of this information, including FBI's involvement in the John Doe investigation in Wisconsin? Okay, we've sent you a letter there. Really, we got a non-response response. These are serious questions, very targeted. Again, I'm incredibly sensitive to the jobs you have here. I want you keeping this nation safe, primarily focused on that. That's why I'd like to get to the bottom of this, get it behind us, and move on.
We'd be happy to sit down with you.
Okay, thank you. Senator McCaskill, you have anything?
I don't.
Again, I want to thank all three of you for your dedicated service, your families as well. You probably don't spend a whole lot of time with your families as you're used to, so we understand this is a complete family sacrifice as well. And again, the men and women that serve with you, they're extraordinary, and we understand that. And we thank them for their service. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until October 25th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.
I think Tim didn't come, but watched it remotely.
Yeah, at 8:30 call time.
Yeah, you saw. I found it a little challenging.
Yeah, I was a little late myself. Stuff.